Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a time and a place that feels plucked straight from a forgotten storybook. Picture it, a small quiet village nestled deep in the French countryside, bathed in the soft fading light of a long past afternoon. You can almost feel the cobblestones beneath your feet, smell the wood smoke curling from chimneys, hear the distant lowing of cattle, and the murmur of conversation drifting on the breeze. It's a scene of utter, almost boring tranquility. A place where nothing much happens, and that's just how everyone likes it. Except, of course, for the one thing that did happen. Something that silenced an entire community. Yeah, you probably won't survive this level of historical peace. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive not with a dramatic flourish or a mysterious fog, but simply by turning off a dusty road and finding yourself on the edge of this quiet place. Let's call it Saint Felix, though the name isn't really important. What matters is the feeling it gives you. It's the kind of village where the church bell dictates the rhythm of the day, calling everyone to prayer, marking the midday meal, signaling the close of dusk. You see children playing simple games in the square, perhaps rolling hoops or chasing chickens. Their laughter a bright counterpoint to the deeper tones of adult voices. Women gather at the communal wash house by the stream, the rhythmic thwack of laundry against stone echoing softly. Men are returning from the field's tools slung over shoulders, perhaps stopping for a quick drink at the small tavern where the patron knows everyone's name and their favorite vintage of local wine. This isn't a bustling metropolis, clearly. There are no grand palaces, no sweeping boulevards. Just practical stone and timber houses clustered together for warmth and companionship. Gardens are small but diligently tended, overflowing with vegetables and herbs. A few ducks waddle across a muddy patch near the baker's shop, where the smell of fresh bread is a constant, comforting presence. Life here is dictated by the seasons, the harvest, the simple, enduring needs of daily survival. You wouldn't expect drama. You wouldn't expect anything out of the ordinary, which of course makes what happened here all the more unsettling. Think about your own life. The constant chatter, the background noise of phones, traffic, TV conversations. Now imagine peeling all that away layer by layer. In Saint Felix, the background noise isn't electronic, it's human. It's the hum of voices, the greetings exchanged in the street, the stories told over dinner, the arguments between siblings, the quiet comfort of sharing thoughts with a loved one. This is the very fabric of their community, woven from spoken words. This oral tradition is how history is passed down, how news travels slowly and perfectly, how social bonds are maintained. A mainstream historical fact about communities like this is that illiteracy was common in rural areas for a significant portion of history, making spoken communication the primary means of information exchange and cultural transmission. So the ability to speak to converse wasn't just a convenience, it was fundamental to social existence itself. You might notice a few little things that seem a bit different, though, if you looked closely. Maybe the village priest has a slightly unusual collection of remedies involving boiled animal parts passed down through generations. A quirky tidbit that hints at the blend of formal religion and older folk practices common in rural life. Or perhaps there's a local superstition about a certain patch of woods whispered about in hushed tones, something to do with the fair folk or mischievous spirits, showing that even in a seemingly Christian society, ancient beliefs still held sway. These aren't major things, not yet, just the small idiosyncrasies that make any place unique. The air itself seems calm, carrying the scent of damp earth and cut grass. You can hear the distant bleating of sheep, the rhythmic clang of a hammer from the blacksmith's forge. It's a symphony of ordinary sounds, each one a confirmation that life is proceeding as it should. No alarms, no crises, just the steady flow of time marked by simple tasks and social interactions. Historians still argue whether life in such remote villages was genuinely idyllic or simply brutally hard and isolated, glossed over by romantic nostalgia. But looking at Saint Felix now, before it seems undeniably peaceful. Almost too peaceful in retrospect. Like the quiet before a storm you could never have predicted. You might find yourself yawning already. Good, that's the point. Let the gentle rhythm of this historical snapshot lull you. Imagine sitting outside the tavern as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the square. You're nursing a simple glass of wine, listening to the villagers chatting. They're talking about the price of grain, the prospects for the next harvest, perhaps a local dispute over a boundary line. Mundane stuff. The kind of conversations that fill the vast majority of human history. No grand political debates, no philosophical musings. Just the everyday concerns of people living close to the land. It's strangely comforting, isn't it? This predictable, unchanging rhythm. You might even think, this isn't boring at all. This is actually quite serene. Give it a minute. We're just setting the stage. The silence hasn't fallen yet. The voices are still here, vibrant and alive. You hear an old woman complaining about her rheumatism, a young man boasting about his strength, children giggling as they chase fireflies. It's the sound of a community connected, communicating, existing through shared sound and meaning. But the quiet that is coming isn't serene. It's something else entirely. It's a vacuum, a sudden terrifying absence, where the familiar sounds of human connection ought to be. And the baffling thing, it wasn't imposed by an external force. No conquering army arrived and decreed silence. No plague swept through, leaving people too weak to speak. It was something that seemed to originate within the villagers themselves. A slow, creeping affliction that stole their words one by one until the vibrant tapestry of village chatter began to unravel thread by painstaking thread. You're watching in this moment the last few threads before that unraveling truly begins. The last conversations, the last shared jokes, probably about the mayor's ill-fitting hat, because small village politics are universal comedy, the last whispered secrets. Soak it in, because the silence is coming, and it will redefine this peaceful little corner of the world in ways nobody could have possibly imagined. And you sitting here in the twilight are about to witness its first terrifying approach. You might want to take a sip of water, or maybe just let your eyelids feel heavy. That works too. The twilight deepens and that peaceful hum of conversation you were just soaking in. It doesn't vanish overnight, not like a snapped thread. Instead, it begins to fray, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Imagine sitting there listening, and you notice old Madame Dubois, the one who always has a story about her prize-winning hen, pauses. Not just a thinking pause, but a blank one. Her eyes seem to lose focus for a second, a slight frown creasing her brow, and then she finishes her sentence, but the ending feels tacked on, somehow disconnected. You shrug it off. Maybe she's tired. We all lose our train of thought, right? Then you see the baker, Monsieur Antoine, usually so voluble about the precise temperature of his oven and the fickleness of yeast. Someone asks him for a loaf, and he points. Just points. When they ask which one, he seems to struggle for a moment, looking at the different loaves, then back at the customer, a frustrated flush rising on his cheeks. He manages to stammer out, the long one. But it takes effort, visible effort. You think maybe he's had a rough morning. Overslept perhaps. Burned a batch. Little things, isolated incidents. But they start to accumulate. The conversations around the tavern tables aren't flowing quite as smoothly. More hesitations. More searches for the right word. Someone starts a sentence, trails off, shakes their head as if clearing cobwebs, and then tries again, often using a simpler, less precise phrase than they normally would. It's like everyone is suddenly speaking a slightly impoverished version of their own language. The rich idioms, the colorful metaphors that pepper everyday speech, they start to fade. You might hear someone try to describe a sunset, and instead of waxing poetic, they just say, "It was pretty. The sky was colored." It's accurate, but it's thin. The villagers start to talk about it, of course, but even that conversation is difficult. Have you noticed? Someone might begin then, gesture vaguely. Yes, another replies. It's like the words aren't there. They try to explain it, but describing the absence of something, especially something as fundamental as language, is incredibly challenging even when your words are working perfectly. You see the worry growing in their eyes, the confusion etched on their faces. It's not just forgetting a name. It feels deeper, more fundamental. Like the connection between the thought and the sound, the meaning and the mouth is being stretched thin, threatening to snap. Children are affected too, which is perhaps the most heartbreaking part. Their natural chatter, the endless questions and observations that bounce around a village square, become quieter, less confident. A child points to a bird, and instead of exclaiming, "Look a robin," they might just make a soft chirping sound or stare their small face troubled. This is particularly worrying because language acquisition in childhood is such a rapid and instinctive process. A mainstream historical fact is that in societies with strong oral traditions, children absorb complex linguistic patterns and a vast vocabulary through constant exposure and participation in adult conversations and storytelling from a very young age. To see that natural flow falter is deeply unsettling. They try remedies naturally. This is a time and place where folk medicine and superstition mingle freely. The priest might suggest prayers and fasting, blaming some unseen moral failing or perhaps demonic influence. A common historical explanation for inexplicable afflictions. The village wise woman might brew potions from strange herbs, perhaps involving ingredients like crushed beetles or dew, collected only under a certain phase of the moon. A quirky tidbit showing the persistence of ancient beliefs and experimental, if often ineffective, medicinal practices. People try wearing charms, avoiding certain places, repeating simple rhymes before speaking anything to try and coax the words back. None of it works, of course. The silence creeps on, indifferent to prayers or potions. Think about trying to describe something complex to someone, but you suddenly can't use any of the specific nouns or verbs you need. You're stuck with gestures and vague descriptors. Imagine trying to haggle at the market like that. "I want that," you point to the chickens. How much you might manage, maybe just holding up a hand with question in your eyes. The seller holds up fingers. You shake your head. They hold up more fingers. It becomes a slow, frustrating pantomime, draining the life out of what was once a lively back and forth. The market, the heart of local commerce and social gossip, becomes quieter transactions, taking longer patience wearing thin. You might crack a nervous joke about how maybe everyone's just getting better at charades, but even that feels hollow. The fear isn't panic yet, it's more like a persistent low-grade fever of anxiety. People start to rely more on gestures, on facial expressions. They communicate with their eyes, with touches on the arm. It's a return to a more primal form of communication, one that predates complex language, but it's profoundly inadequate for the nuances of adult life, for sharing a complex thought, for resolving a disagreement, for expressing abstract ideas or deep emotions. Historians still argue whether this period marked a total collapse of cognitive function related to language, or a specific isolated inability to produce spoken words, while internal thought processes remained relatively intact. The villagers themselves could only describe the feeling of the words being trapped like birds refusing to leave a cage. You see families struggling, parents trying to instruct their children, their voices hesitant, the simple commands, "Fetch water," "Close the door," requiring painful effort. Husbands and wives finding it harder to share the worries of the day, the comfort of easy conversation fading into a shared troubled silence. The silence isn't empty. It's filled with unspoken frustration, with fear, with a growing sense of isolation even when surrounded by others. It's the sound of connection being severed thread by thread. The rhythm of the village, which felt so steady and comforting in Section 1, begins to falter. The church bell still rings, but the response is different. People attend Mass, but their responses to the prayers are mumbled, hesitant, sometimes falling silent entirely. The priest's sermon, if he can deliver it without faltering himself, feels alien, the words washing over a congregation that is increasingly unable to vocalize their understanding or belief. Even singing, which often accesses a different part of the brain than speech, becomes difficult for some. The communal singing that was a comfort during work or worship starts to die out, replaced by a haunting quiet. It feels like the village is holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. And you, the observer, can only watch and listen as the sounds of spoken life slowly ebb away. The quiet that began as a subtle hint is becoming a presence, a character in this strange historical drama, gradually enveloping everything. And it's far from boring now. It's just quiet. Too quiet. The subtle fraying described in Section 2. It's no longer subtle. The threads aren't just thinning, they're snapping. The hesitant pauses are becoming longer silences. The search for the right word is turning into a frustrated, wordless struggle. Imagine trying to tell someone you need the hammer, but all you can do is point vaguely at the shed and make hammering motions. It's like being trapped behind a pane of glass. You can see the world, you can think your thoughts, but the connection, the vital link between the inner self and the outer expression through language is severely compromised. You watch as the villagers' faces, once open and expressive through their speech, become increasingly massive confusion, fear, or blankness. This isn't just inconvenient, it's catastrophic for daily life in a close-knit agrarian community. Farming, the very foundation of their existence, relies heavily on communication. Coordinating tasks in the fields. Bring the oxen here. Weed this row. The rain is coming, we need to harvest. Becomes nearly impossible. Gestures can only convey so much. You might try to signal a complex instruction, demonstrating with your hands, but the other person just stares back, nodding slowly, their eyes distant, and then they do something completely different, something that makes no sense. Frustration flares, but even expressing that frustration is difficult. Shouting becomes a common sound, not in anger usually, but in sheer guttling frustration at the inability to connect. You see farmers abandoning fields, unable to effectively manage the complex process of planting, tending, and harvesting with their teams. The meticulous rhythm of agricultural life, honed over generations, breaks down. Trade too collapses. The market square, which was quiet in Section 2, is now eerily silent or filled with the awkward sounds of fumbling gestures and strained grunts. Haggling is impossible. How do you negotiate a price when you can't name the goods or the quantity or the value someone holds up a chicken? You hold up 3 fingers, they shake their head vigorously. You hold up 2, they look away defeated. The intricate web of commerce, the lifeblood of any village connected to others, withers. Merchants from outside the village, if they are brave enough to even enter this place of strange silence, find transactions impossible and leave quickly spreading unsettling tales of the dumb village. Social interactions outside of necessity fare even worse. Remember the tavern, the hub of gossip and camaraderie. It's deserted now. What's the point of gathering if you can't share a story, laugh at a joke, debate local affairs, or simply chat about your day? The silence in the homes is perhaps the most profound. Families eat meals together, but the lively conversation that once accompanied the shared food is gone. The parents can't easily teach the children. The elderly can't pass down their wisdom or their history. Stories fade unrepeated. Songs are forgotten unsung. It's not just communication that's lost, it's culture, memory, identity. A mainstream historical fact is that in pre-literate or semi-literate societies, the transmission of knowledge, history, and cultural values relied almost entirely on oral tradition. Stories, songs, proverbs, detailed instructions passed down verbally. The loss of the ability to speak effectively cripples this vital process, essentially severing the village from its own past and future. Religious life suffers too. While the priest might try to continue services, the communal aspect is diminished. The call and response of prayers, the singing of hymns, the ability of the congregation to confess or seek counsel, all these vital components of shared worship vanish or become painful, distorted mockeries. You might see someone trying to confess, making agonized sounds and gestures in the confessional box, the priest on the other side listening, his face a mixture of pity and helplessness. This isn't just a loss of communal practice. For many, it's a loss of their primary connection to the divine, to solace, to hope. Think about the simple things you take for granted. Asking for help when you're injured, expressing love or comfort to someone who is hurting, sharing a worry or a fear, complimenting a neighbor on their garden. None of these easy, everyday interactions are possible anymore. You see people trying, their faces contorted with effort, but only strangled sounds or frustrated silence emerges. It's like watching people drown in a sea of unspoken words. The isolation becomes palpable. Even surrounded by others, each person is increasingly trapped within their own head, their thoughts and feelings locked away with no key. The village turns inward, becoming suspicious and fearful. Without easy conversation, misunderstandings flourish. A misinterpreted gesture can lead to anger. A blank stare can be seen as hostility. Trust erodes. Neighbors who once helped each other without a second thought now eye each other warily, unsure how to interact, unsure if the other person is even capable of understanding or responding. The cooperative spirit essential for survival in a harsh environment weakens. You see houses becoming neglected tasks left undone because coordinating help is too difficult. The once vibrant sounds of the village, the calls of vendors, the laughter of children, the hum of conversation, the shared singing, the rhythmic chanting of laborers, are replaced by a low, persistent undercurrent of wordless sounds, frustrated grunts, soft whimpers, sighs of despair, the shuffling of feet, the creaking of doors, the sounds of labor stripped of its verbal accompaniment. It's a soundtrack of decline, a haunting emptiness where human connection used to thrive. There are still attempts to communicate, of course. People draw pictures in the dirt. They try to write if they are literate, but writing takes time and effort and isn't practical for immediate needs. And even writing might feel difficult, as if the same blockage affects the connection between thought and written symbol. You see someone trying to leave a message for a neighbor, painstakingly drawing a rudimentary picture of a broken tool, pointing at it, then pointing at the neighbor's house. It's slow, inefficient, and prone to error. A quirky tidbit from historical accounts of similar, though less extreme phenomena, often linked to specific illnesses or conditions, is the development of elaborate, sometimes highly localized sign languages or gestural codes within affected communities. While not a perfect substitute for spoken language, these codes allowed for some degree of complex communication to persist. In this village, however, the onset was too rapid and perhaps too widespread for a truly functional new language system to emerge quickly enough. Any gestural communication that develops is rudimentary, born of immediate necessity rather than a structured system. The emotional toll is immense. Imagine losing the ability to tell your child you love them, to comfort your spouse, to articulate your grief or your joy. The inability to share these fundamental human experiences in words must feel like a slow death of the soul. You see eyes filled with unshed tears, faces contorted in silent anguish. The silence isn't peaceful. It's a heavy, oppressive weight. Historians still argue whether the cause of this affliction was purely physiological, a strange form of epidemic aphasia affecting the brain's language centers, or if there was a significant psychological component, perhaps a mass suggestion or shared trauma that manifested as an inability to speak. The lack of surviving medical records or detailed contemporary accounts leaves much open to interpretation. All that is certain is the devastating effect it had on the lives of these villagers. The fabric of their society is not just torn, it's unraveling completely. The structures that held them together, shared work, communal worship, social bonds built on conversation, are disintegrating. The village isn't just losing its voice, it's losing its shape, its purpose, its very identity as a community. And the quiet deepens, becoming less a backdrop and more the main event, pushing everything else to the fringes. You realize that boring was a luxury of a world where communication was effortless. This silent world is anything but boring, it's terrifying. So as the spoken word became a ghost haunting the village, you see the villagers doing what humans have always done, trying to adapt. Trying to find a way around this gaping chasm that has opened up between their minds and the world. The fleeting attempts at communication mentioned earlier, they don't stop. They just get more frantic, more desperate. Imagine trying to rebuild society using only charades and badly drawn stick figures. It's kind of like trying to explain the plot of Inception using only interpretive dance. Possible, maybe. Efficient or effective? Absolutely not. You see people reverting to basic gestures, pointing, nodding, shaking heads. But how do you differentiate between, I need help lifting this beam, and I need help because there's a spider on me? Context helps, sure, but it's agonizingly slow. You watch as someone tries to explain a repair needed on a tool. They might mime hammering, then point at the broken handle, then shrug hopelessly. The other person watches, brow furrowed, offering different tools, pointing at different parts of the object. Each attempt met with frustrated shakes of the head or exasperated sighs. What used to take a few seconds and a clear sentence now consumes minutes, sometimes hours of trial and error, leaving everyone exhausted and irritable. Drawing becomes another favored, albeit limited method. You see people scratching pictures in the dirt with sticks, or finding scraps of charcoal to sketch on walls or pieces of wood. A crude drawing of a chicken next to two circles might mean two chickens. A picture of a plow with a broken line could signify the plow is broken. But again, complexity is the enemy. How do you draw, I think the soil needs more lime this year, or my grandmother isn't feeling well, could you bring some soup? You can't. The nuances, the abstract thoughts, the feelings, the things that make human connection deep and meaningful, are utterly lost in translation. It's like trying to write a novel using only emojis. You get the general vibe maybe, but not the story. For the few who are literate, writing is a possibility. You might see someone painstakingly writing a short, simple message on a piece of parchment or scraped bark. But paper is scarce, ink is scarcer, and not everyone can read or write. Literacy was a privilege, not a universal skill, especially in rural communities of this era. A mainstream historical fact is that widespread literacy, as we understand it today, is a relatively modern phenomenon. In many historical periods, literacy rates were low, particularly outside of urban centers or among the clergy and nobility. For a typical peasant village, relying on writing for daily communication would have been impractical in the extreme. So writing offers a tiny lifeline for a few, for the simplest messages, but it's no substitute for the fluid, instant nature of speech that everyone possessed. The attempts to create a village-wide sign language are born of necessity, but hampered by the rapid onset and chaotic nature of the affliction. It's not like a structured process where people could sit down and agree on signs. It's more like everyone invents their own signs on the fly, hoping they'll be understood. You see different families developing their own little communication quirks. A flick of the wrist might mean yes in one household, but finished in another. A hand clap might mean attention to one person and hungry to someone else. It's a Tower of Babel in silence, each person speaking a dialect of gesture that only they and maybe their immediate family truly understand. This lack of a unified, agreed-upon system makes communication between families or across the village square incredibly difficult, almost impossible. It's like trying to navigate a conversation where everyone is using slang from a different decade. Groovy, tubular, lit, good luck. These desperate coping mechanisms, while showing the resilience of the human spirit, ultimately highlight the profound loss. They are crutches, not replacements. They allow for the bare minimum, the exchange of essential needs like food, water, shelter, and perhaps basic commands related to survival. But they don't allow for discussion, for planning beyond the immediate, for expressing regret or offering comfort in a truly meaningful way. Life continues, yes, in a brutal, simplified form. The fields are still worked, but less efficiently, with more errors, more wasted effort due to failed coordination. The harvest is smaller, less secure. Food becomes a constant worry. Trade with the outside world has effectively ceased, cutting off access to goods they can't produce themselves, like salt metal tools or certain medicines. You see villagers wearing increasingly ragged clothes, unable to trade for new cloth. Tools break and cannot be easily replaced or repaired without clear communication about what's needed. The self-sufficiency of the village, which relies on the knowledge of how to do things being passed down and shared, erodes because that knowledge transfer was primarily oral. Imagine trying to teach a complex skill like weaving or blacksmithing using only gestures and drawings. It's incredibly challenging. The apprentices learn slower, make more mistakes, and the quality of craftsmanship declines. Over time, essential skills start to disappear from the village, not because the people forgot how to do them internally, but because they can't transmit the how effectively. It's like having all the recipes in your head, but being unable to write them down or tell anyone. Your culinary genius dies with you. The psychological toll continues to mount. The constant effort of trying to communicate, the repeated failures, the sheer frustration, it grinds people down. You see a pervasive weariness setting in, a kind of quiet despair. The spark goes out of people's eyes. There's less laughter, even less of the frustrated shouting from before. It's replaced by a heavy, resigned silence. People retreat into themselves, their inability to connect, pushing them further into isolation. The sense of community already fraying weakens further as the bonds of shared conversation dissolve. Sharing a meal might happen, but the camaraderie, the jokes, the gossip that strengthened social ties are gone. It's just people silently putting food in their mouths, the only sounds the clinking of spoons and the chewing. Conflict resolution becomes almost impossible. In any community, disagreements arise. Normally, you'd talk it out, maybe argue, maybe compromise. But how do you resolve a dispute over property boundaries or a perceived slight when you can't even articulate the problem? You see tensions simmer unresolved. Minor disagreements can escalate into wordless shoving matches or silent feuds that linger for years. The social glue is gone, and without it, friction becomes destructive. It's like trying to settle a parking dispute with only air horns and interpretive dance. Someone's getting keyed. Even the simple act of planning for the future becomes a monumental task. How do you plan crop rotation for next year? How do you organize the building of a new barn? How do you prepare for winter? These require shared understanding, discussion agreement, things that are now out of reach. The village starts living in the present day-to-day, unable to project forward because they lack the tools for collective planning. A quirky tidbit about communication is that even in societies where oral tradition was dominant, there were often nonverbal forms of communication that carried significant weight, like elaborate greetings, specific postures, or symbolic objects used in rituals or negotiations. While these existed to complement speech, they were rarely complex enough to replace it entirely for the full range of human interaction. They provided context or emphasis, not the core message itself. Historians still argue whether the deterioration seen in the village was solely a direct consequence of the communication failure, or if the underlying cause of the linguistic breakdown also had broader cognitive effects that contributed to the general decline in organization and skill. Was it just the inability to speak, or was there a related impact on memory executive function, or the ability to sequence complex tasks? The evidence is ambiguous, based mostly on anecdotal accounts filtered through outsiders. You watch as the village slowly starves, not necessarily for lack of effort in the fields, but for lack of coordination, knowledge transfer, and access to outside resources. The attempts to cope are valiant, a testament to the human drive to connect and survive, but they are insufficient. They are like trying to hold back a flood with a colander. The water keeps coming, the level keeps rising, and the village continues its silent, agonizing decline. The quiet isn't just empty anymore. It feels like a weight pressing down, suffocating the life out of everything it touches. The hope that initially flickered with the first attempts at drawing or gesturing begins to fade, replaced by a grim resignation. The silence isn't a peaceful void, it's a hungry one, consuming their world piece by piece. As the communication breakdown solidifies, becoming less of a strange event and more of a horrifying reality, the mood in the village shifts again. The initial confusion and frantic attempts to cope give way to something darker, something colder. You see the villagers start to pull away, not just from each other, because communication is hard, but emotionally. Fear begins to take root, a deep, unsettling dread that settles in the pit of your stomach and never really leaves. It's the fear of the unknown, amplified by the absolute inability to talk about it, to share anxieties, or offer mutual comfort. Imagine going through something terrifying, something truly bizarre, and the only person you can talk to is yourself. Now imagine that everyone around you is going through it too, but you're all trapped in separate, silent bubbles of panic. This fear isn't just about survival anymore, about the dwindling food or broken tools. It's existential. It gnaws at the edges of your sanity. What gives everyone this? Why? In the absence of answers and with the inability to formulate rational explanations, collectively minds start to grasp for anything that might make sense. And in this era, when the natural world was often seen through the lens of the supernatural, it's no surprise where those thoughts lead. Superstition, always simmering beneath the surface of daily life, boils over. You see whispered glances, furtive signs made to ward off the evil eye. Villagers who might have been slightly odd before are now eyed with deep suspicion. Was it them? Did they do something? Maybe old Mare Dubois, who always talked to her cats a bit too much, cast a spell. Or the stranger who passed through the village a week before it happened, muttering to himself. The silence doesn't just hide thoughts, it breeds suspicion. You can't ask someone what they meant by that look or explain that you weren't plotting against them. You were just trying to remember if you'd locked the chickens in. Every gesture, every facial expression is now open to fearful misinterpretation. The village, previously a place of shared burdens and communal life, begins to fracture along invisible lines of mistrust. People avoid each other not just because communication is difficult, but because they're afraid of what they can't understand in others, and afraid of being blamed for something they don't comprehend themselves. The shared silence that initially might have felt heavy now feels hostile. As fear takes hold, the village naturally becomes a pariah to the outside world. News travels slowly, but it does travel. Peddlers who used to stop there to sell their wares hear strange rumors. Hunters or farmers from neighboring hamlets who venture too close report unsettling encounters. They see people acting strangely, communicating in bizarre, silent ways, their faces etched with fear and confusion. They see the village fields not being worked with the usual coordinated rhythm, but in a disjointed, almost desperate fashion. They might try to call out to ask what's wrong, but get only silent stares or panicked gestures in return. It's like something out of a bad dream, a village where the people have forgotten how to be people in the most fundamental way. Imagine you're a traveling merchant used to the lively chatter of a village market square. You approach this place, and instead of calls of greeting or haggling, you are met with an unnerving silence. People watch you with wide, frightened eyes. You try to ask the price of bread, miming eating, pointing at the loaf. You might get a frantic shake of the head, or perhaps a villager simply turns and hurries away. It's unsettling, deeply, profoundly unsettling. Your instincts scream at you to leave, to get away from this unnatural place. So the roads that used to lead to the village become less traveled. Neighbors from other communities who might have traded goods or exchanged news stop coming. The village becomes isolated not just by its internal linguistic collapse, but by a quarantine of fear imposed by the outside world. It's sealed off a strange, silent island in a sea of speaking communities. This isolation exacerbates all the problems already faced by the villagers. Without trade, they can't acquire necessary supplies. Without interaction with the outside world, they can't seek help, they can't get information, and they can't escape. They are trapped by their silence within walls of fear and suspicion, both their own and others. It's like being stuck on a broken elevator with people you suddenly suspect might be zombies, and you can't even yell for help through the door. Fun times. The rise of superstitious beliefs leads to tragically irrational behavior. You might see villagers trying to appease whatever they think is causing this affliction. Perhaps they leave offerings at a makeshift shrine by the village well. Maybe they shun certain villagers, believing them to be cursed or the source of the problem. Scapegoats are sought in the silence. Someone might be ostracized or even driven out, accused silently of witchcraft or demonic possession, simply because they look frightened or behave differently. This only further weakens the community, tearing it apart from the inside, based on unfounded fears born of silence. A mainstream historical fact is that during periods of inexplicable crisis or widespread suffering, populations historically often turn to supernatural explanations, leading to outbreaks of superstition, witch trials, or religious fervor as they sought meaning and control in the face of the unknown. The silent affliction would certainly qualify as an inexplicable crisis, ripe for such a reaction. The psychological toll of this escalating fear and isolation is immense. Depression becomes rampant. Hope, already dimming, is harder to find. You see people with haunted eyes jumping at shadows, interpreting every rustle of leaves or creak of wood as a bad omen. Sleep offers little respite, likely filled with nightmares, where the silence is a suffocating blanket or the world is a cacophony of sounds you can no longer name or understand. The ability to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones blurs in the fog of constant anxiety. The silence isn't passive anymore. It's an active oppressor. It prevents reassurance, prevents shared comfort, prevents the voice of reason from cutting through the rising tide of panic. It allows fear to grow unchecked in the dark corners of the mind. You try to remember what it felt like to laugh with someone, to share a joke, to simply ask, "How are you?" and hear a response. These memories become painful ghosts haunting the silent present. The village's pariah status isn't just about outsiders avoiding them. It affects the villagers themselves. Knowing that you are feared, seen as something strange and possibly dangerous, adds another layer of psychological burden. It reinforces the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with them, that they are cursed or marked. This internalizes the fear, making it a part of their identity as a community. They are the silent village, the cursed place no one dares approach. You might see desperate attempts to signal to the outside world to explain, but these are futile. Maybe someone lights a signal fire hoping to attract attention. When someone cautiously approaches the villagers, rush forward, gesturing frantically, their faces pleading. But the outsiders confronted with this silent, gesticulating crowd are terrified, convinced this is some kind of trap or the signs of madness. They retreat quickly, spreading even more fearful tales about the place. It's a vicious cycle. The more the villagers try to communicate their distress silently, the more they are perceived as alien and threatening by those who still have speech. A quirky tidbit related to historical pariah groups is how certain illnesses or conditions like leprosy or even mental illness, before it was understood, medically led to communities being ostracized and isolated, often based on fear and lack of knowledge rather than actual danger. The silent village fits this pattern of a community being feared and avoided due to a mysterious and unsettling affliction. Historians still argue whether the level of superstition and paranoia reached in the village was a direct symptom of the same underlying cause that stole their speech or a purely psychological reaction to the trauma and isolation imposed by the linguistic collapse. Did the affliction itself affect cognitive processes related to rational thought and fear? Or was it simply the natural human response to an unimaginable stressor? The question remains open, lost in the silence of the historical record. The feeling of being watched both by unseen forces and by fearful outsiders adds to the oppressive atmosphere. You feel eyes on you even when you're alone in your small house. The silence inside is matched by the silence outside, amplifying the sense of being cut off. The world continues outside the village boundaries. People talk, they trade, they live their noisy, connected lives. But for you and everyone else in the village, that world feels like a distant, unreachable shore. You are marooned on an island of silence, and the tide is slowly rising. The initial desperation to communicate has curdled into a weary acceptance for some and a volatile, fearful paranoia for others. The community that was is dissolving, replaced by a collection of isolated, frightened souls huddled together in a terrifying quiet. The paralysis of fear and the oppressive weight of isolation can only last so long when your stomach is rumbling and the winter stores are dwindling. Eventually, the raw instinctual drive to survive nudges you gently at first, then with increasing urgency out of the fog of panic. You can't stay hidden forever, shivering with dread, interpreting every rustle of leaves as an omen. The fields still need tending, the animals need feeding, roofs leak, and bodies get sick. Life in its most basic demanding form insists on continuing even in the absence of words. So you emerge from your fear-haunted home, blinking in the sunlight that suddenly feels too bright, too indifferent. Others are doing the same, drawn out by the same undeniable needs. There's no grand announcement, no village meeting called by a leader who can no longer call out. It's a hesitant, piecemeal re-engagement with reality. You see your neighbor Père Michel standing by his cart looking at a broken wheel. He looks up as you approach, and for a moment that familiar fear flashes in his eyes. Is this person blaming him? But then the shared problem asserts itself. He points to the wheel mimes lifting something heavy, points to his back, grimaces. He's asking for help. This is the new reality, the desperate fumbling attempts to communicate the absolute necessities of life through gestures, expressions, and raw effort. Repairing that wheel together takes 3 times as long, without being able to discuss leverage or where to apply force or even just say, careful, mind your fingers. It's a clumsy, often frustrating dance of trial and error. You point, you grunt, you shrug, you mime. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it leads to more confusion, exasperation, or even minor injuries because you couldn't shout a warning. Think about farming. How do you coordinate a planting or a harvest without being able to call out instructions, discuss the weather forecast, or decide which field to tackle next? It becomes a brutal physical ballet. Someone starts working a row. Others watch, try to figure out the pattern and join in. You point to the sky if rain looks imminent, gesturing towards the barns. You drag a hand across your brow to indicate exhaustion, miming drinking water. It's exhausting in a way that speech always buffered. Words allowed for planning, for division of labor, for teaching, for simple encouragement. Now it's just action observed and imitated or failed and corrected through frustrated gestures and shakes of the head. Bartering within the village becomes a silent auction of need. You have eggs, your neighbor has flour. You hold up 2 eggs, point to the flower, hold up 1 finger questioningly. They shake their head, hold up 2 fingers. You frown gesture dramatically at your chickens laying fewer eggs. They might mime digging harder in their field for wheat. It's a slow visual negotiation, often ending with a simple nod of reluctant agreement or a frustrated turning away. This reliance on visual cues heightens your observational skills, but it also makes subtle transactions incredibly difficult. There's no throw in a little extra banter, no discussing the quality of the goods beyond what you can show. Caring for the most vulnerable, the elderly and the very young, becomes a monumental task. How do you explain to an aging parent that they need medicine or get a frightened child to articulate where they hurt? It's all about observation, intuition, and a deep, often agonizing empathy. You learn to read faces with an intensity you never needed before. A flicker in the eyes, a tremor in the hand, a subtle shift in posture. These become the only language you have to understand someone's pain or fear or hunger. It's a constant draining effort of interpretation. The silence forces innovation out of necessity, but it's a limited practical kind of innovation. Someone figures out that leaving certain tools in specific places signals what work needs doing. A tied knot on a fence post might indicate a problem in that field. Simple symbols might begin to emerge. A drawing of a goat on a piece of wood to mark an enclosure, a rough sketch of a broken handle to show a need for repair. These are not the sophisticated symbols of a written language, which requires shared concepts and abstract thought. They are purely functional, born of immediate need. It's like reverting to the most basic picture-based operating system after losing access to all your software and the internet. The constant pressure to survive without speech highlights just how much of our complex social structure relies on spoken communication. Think about settling disputes. Without words, arguments can escalate quickly into physical altercations. Misunderstandings are rife. Imagine someone accidentally taking your tool and you can't say, "Excuse me, that's mine." All you can do is point gesture, angrily, perhaps try to take it back. This fertile ground for conflict is just another layer of stress on a community already stretched to its breaking point by fear and isolation. Yet amidst the struggle, there are moments of unexpected connection. A shared smile after a task is finally completed. A comforting touch on the shoulder when someone is clearly distressed. A simple nod of understanding that transcends the need for words. These small acts of nonverbal affirmation become incredibly precious tiny islands of human connection in a vast, silent sea. They remind you that the people around you are still people, even if the most fundamental way you knew them, their voice, their words, their stories, is gone. One of the primary challenges of adapting to a silent existence is the sheer cognitive load it imposes. Every interaction, every task that used to be automatic or easily discussed now requires intense focus and effort. You have to constantly think about how to convey your meaning without sound, observe others meticulously to understand their intentions and interpret a world stripped of verbal context. It's mentally exhausting, adding a layer of fatigue to the already immense physical labor of survival. It's like trying to run a marathon while also solving complex calculus problems in your head. Just staying alive feels like a full-time brain-draining job. A mainstream historical fact is that throughout history, human communities have developed complex nonverbal communication systems, such as sign languages, signal fires, drum languages, and visual symbols, particularly in environments where spoken language is impossible, impractical, or shared language is absent. While the silent village's situation was unique in its sudden onset in nature, the human capacity to create some form of shared meaning beyond speech is well documented. The desperation for survival also forces a pragmatic reassessment of priorities. The intricate social dances, the petty squabbles, the gossip that fills the air in any speaking village. Much of that fades away, replaced by the immediate urgent need to find food, ensure shelter, and protect oneself and one's family. There's a brutal efficiency to this silence. You can't waste time on pleasantries or small talk. Every interaction is boiled down to its essential purpose related to basic needs. You learn to anticipate needs based on the time of day or the season. Harvest time means everyone needs to be in the fields coordinated visually. Winter means focusing on storing food and repairing homes against the cold. This reliance on routine and observable patterns replaces the verbal coordination that would normally guide community activities. It's a more rigid, less flexible way of life, dictated by the rhythms of nature and the undeniable demands of the body. The frustration is a constant undercurrent. Imagine trying to explain a complex idea like a new way to repair a tool or a different method for preserving food using only mime and gestures. It's often impossible. Knowledge transfer slows to a crawl. The collective wisdom that would normally be passed down through stories, instructions, and discussions is now trapped within individuals unless it can be physically demonstrated and replicated. This inability to share detailed information hinders problem solving and prevents innovation beyond the most rudimentary level. It's like trying to build a complicated machine when you can only point at the parts and make frustrated noises. Quirky tidbit. Some nonverbal communication systems developed in history were incredibly sophisticated. For example, the drum languages of West Africa could communicate complex messages over long distances by mimicking the tonal patterns of spoken languages, effectively creating a form of talking drums that could convey news warnings or even proverbs. The silent village's gestures were likely much simpler, born of immediate necessity rather than cultural tradition. Historians still argue whether the breakdown in complex reasoning observed in the silent village was solely a consequence of the lack of linguistic tools for thought and communication, or if the underlying affliction that stole their speech also directly impacted cognitive functions necessary for abstract thought and planning. Was the inability to solve complex problems a symptom of the silence itself or of a deeper neurological issue? The precise nature of the cause remains elusive, shrouded by centuries of silence. Despite the hardship, a certain resilience emerges. You see people finding strength in the shared struggle, even if they can't voice it. There are moments of quiet solidarity, a knowing look exchanged between two villagers who successfully work together to solve a problem. It's a different kind of community bond forged in silence and necessity, based on mutual aid and shared endurance, rather than conversation and shared laughter. It's a grim, determined clinging to existence in the face of an absurd, terrifying reality. They are surviving, but it is a brutal, stripped-down version of life, defined by the absence of the very thing that makes us most uniquely human, the ability to speak our thoughts and feelings aloud. The focus shifts from understanding why this happened or fearing what comes next to the simple, relentless grind of just getting through today. The silence has stripped life back to its bare animalistic essentials, the need to eat, to shelter, to protect. The gnawing anxiety you feel, the internal struggle for survival, isn't confined to the valley. Rumors, distorted whispers carried on the wind, and by the few brave souls who venture out begin to spread to the surrounding villages and towns. At first it's pity. Poor souls, they say over their own dinner tables, shaking their heads. Imagine to lose your voice. But pity is a fragile thing, easily curdled by fear, especially when the affliction is so utterly strange, so inexplicable. Remember how you sometimes had to leave the valley to trade goods at the market in the next town, to visit a distant relative, perhaps even in the desperate early days to seek help from a doctor or priest beyond your own silent borders. These journeys, once routine, now become fraught with a new kind of peril, not from the silence within you, but from the reaction of the speaking world outside. You trudge into the market square, perhaps carrying a basket of eggs or a bundle of firewood, the silence preceding you like a chilling fog. People who knew you, who traded with you for years, see you approach and their faces shift. The initial recognition is quickly replaced by apprehension, then outright fear. They don't greet you with a cheerful bonjour or ask about your family. They shrink back. Stalls are quickly attended to by others, their owners suddenly busy elsewhere. Children are pulled close. Hands furtively make the sign of the cross or touch protective amulets. You try to communicate your purpose. You hold up your eggs, mime, counting on your fingers. Point to the loaf of bread you wish to trade for. Your gestures, honed by necessity in the village, look frantic, alien perhaps, even threatening to those who don't understand the new silent language of your need. They see not a desperate person trying to survive, but a carrier of an unknown curse, a walking embodiment of a terrifying mystery. Imagine trying to explain you need medicine for a sick child just by pointing at yourself, miming coughs, holding your head, and then miming cradling a baby. To a speaking doctor who has never encountered this silence, it's a horrifying pantomime. He might think you're possessed, afflicted by a demonic influence that has stolen your tongue. He certainly doesn't understand the complex symptoms of the fever you're trying to describe. The best you can hope for is a shrug of confused pity, or more likely a hurried dismissal, a waving away as if you were something unclean. This fear isn't entirely irrational, though it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding. To the outside world, the silence feels like a sickness, a contagious plague of the tongue. If you can lose your voice just by being in this valley, who's to say it won't happen to them? If they get too close, the fact that it doesn't manifest with fever or visible sores makes it even more terrifying. An invisible enemy that steals your very means of connection. It's like the historical panics surrounding things like dancing plagues or sudden unexplained waves of madness. When the cause is unknown and the symptoms bizarre, fear fills the vacuum where understanding should be. So the world begins to draw lines. Roads leading to the silent village become less traveled. Merchants stop coming to trade. Relatives in other towns send back panicked messages telling you not to visit to stay away for their own safety. The informal quarantine begins. It's not enforced by soldiers or locked gates, but by the much more powerful barriers of fear, superstition, and willful avoidance. You are cut off. This external isolation is a second crushing blow. Not only have you lost the ability to speak to each other, but you are now losing your connection to the wider world, to the resources and knowledge that exist beyond your valley. The limited trade you relied on for things you couldn't produce yourselves, salt iron tools, certain medicines, perhaps even seeds for new crops, dries up. Access to information about weather patterns, political events, or anything else happening outside your silent bubble vanishes. You are truly alone. The psychological impact of being shunned is profound. You are used to the struggle within the village, the shared burden of silence. But to be actively feared, recoiled from, treated as an outcast by people you once shared jokes with or traded goods alongside, it adds a layer of shame and despair to your already heavy load. You see the horror in their eyes, the hasty retreat, and you feel branded, marked by something you cannot control and cannot explain. It makes you feel less than human, a pariah in a world that has suddenly decided you are dangerous. Sometimes the fear boils over into aggression. There might be incidents where villagers are verbally abused from a distance, the ultimate irony, or even physically threatened if they get too close to another settlement. Stones might be thrown, warnings shouted from afar. The silent villagers become the bogeymen of the region, the subject of cautionary tales whispered around firesides. Don't go near the Valley of the Silent Ones. Something evil dwells there. Your home becomes a place of dread on the map. Mainstream historical fact. Throughout history, communities facing unexplained afflictions or social deviations have often been ostracized or subjected to forms of quarantine, sometimes with devastating consequences for the isolated group. The reactions to leper colonies in the Middle Ages, or the fear surrounding outbreaks of highly contagious diseases like the plague, demonstrate how quickly fear can lead to social exclusion and the severance of vital connections between communities. The fear of the silent village, though based on a different kind of contagion, mirrors these historical patterns of reaction to perceived threats. The loss of trade means you must become entirely self-sufficient, relying solely on the dwindling resources of your valley and your own limited capacity for innovation without verbal communication. If your tools break and you can't forge new ones, you are stuck. If your crops fail and you can't buy grain from elsewhere, you face starvation. The margin for error, already tiny, shrinks to almost nothing. Every season becomes a desperate gamble against the odds. Think about gossip for a moment. In any normal community, gossip is the unofficial news network, relaying information, shaping reputations, and reinforcing social norms. In your silent village, it's gone. But about your village, the gossip in the outside world flourishes unchecked and wildly inaccurate. You become figures of myth and rumor. Stories circulate about why you lost your voices. Perhaps you angered God. Perhaps it was a curse from a witch. Perhaps you stumbled upon an ancient, forbidden secret. These stories, born of ignorance and fear, paint your reality in increasingly distorted and fantastical colors. You are being defined, judged, and condemned by a world you can no longer interact with, based on stories that have nothing to do with the quiet, desperate reality of your daily struggle. It's like being the subject of a viral internet rumor, but you can't log on to see what's being said or post a single word in your own defense. Quirky tidbit. Historically, certain forms of folk magic or superstition specifically involved rituals to bind the tongue or steal someone's voice, often as a form of curse or control. While these were typically seen as individual afflictions rather than mass village events, the idea of a stolen voice as a form of incapacitation or punishment was present in various cultural beliefs, potentially fueling the superstitious interpretations of the silent village's plight by outsiders. The loss of communication also hinders any possibility of organized help or intervention from the outside. If someone brave or curious enough were to come and try to understand what happened, you couldn't explain. You couldn't recount the events, describe the symptoms, or answer their questions. Your silence itself becomes a barrier to diagnosis, to aid to rescue. You are trapped not just by the silence within you, but by the wall of fear it has built around you. Historians still argue whether the long-term isolation of the village was solely a consequence of external fear and shunning, or if the villagers themselves eventually became so psychologically withdrawn due to the trauma of their affliction and the failure of initial communication attempts that they ceased trying to engage with the outside world, reinforcing their own isolation. Did the world abandon them, or did they, in a sense, abandon the world first? The silence also means that the very memory of what happened begins to fade in the outside world, replaced by the legend. Over generations, the specifics are lost. The names of the villagers become part of folklore. The valley is marked on maps as a place to avoid a footnote in local history, a spooky story to tell children who won't behave. The human tragedy is slowly obscured by myth and fear, leaving behind only the chilling concept of the silent valley, or the village without voices. The irony is palpable. The world fears the silent village because of the silence, but that very fear exacerbates the suffering caused by the silence, cutting them off from the help and connection they so desperately need. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of isolation, driven by panic and ignorance. You are left to navigate your impossible reality, forgotten by a world too afraid to remember you exist except as a cautionary tale. The only sounds that consistently reach your valley now are the rustling leaves, the wind through the trees, the bleating of your own animals, the sounds of a world that doesn't need language to exist. It's a lonely symphony. And perhaps in time, a few of the villagers even begin to internalize the world's fear, seeing themselves through the eyes of those who shun them, adding self-doubt and despair to the already heavy burden of their silence. It's a slow, silent erosion of the soul, amplified by the fact you can't even voice your pain. It makes you wonder if being seen as a monster by everyone else is worse than just feeling like one yourself. At least monsters get cool origin stories. You just got quiet. What a bummer. And so you continue to survive locked within your valley, not only by the lack of shared words, but by the fear of the speaking world outside. Every sunrise brings the same silent tasks, the same fumbling attempts to communicate the same ever-present threat of the outside world's continued rejection. The silence is no longer just an internal affliction. It has become the very boundary of your existence. The world outside might have feared you into isolation, drawing its wary circle around your silent valley, but life within doesn't stop. It simply rearranges itself, a silent, intricate dance, where every gesture carries weight, every expression is a loaded sentence. And in any community isolated or not, the need for order, for direction, for some form of leadership becomes paramount, especially when faced with unprecedented challenges. Think about how decisions were made before. There was probably a mayor, perhaps a village council. Maybe the local priest held considerable sway, offering guidance and moral authority. Village meetings might have been noisy affairs, full of impassioned speeches. Disagreements argued loudly in the square, eventually culminating in a vote or a consensus hammered out through hours of talk. Remember the time Old Man Dubois argued for a full hour about the placement of the new communal well, good times. Or maybe not good times exactly, but certainly loud ones. Now silence reigns. The old ways of making decisions are shattered. The mayor, if he relied on the power of his voice to command respect or persuade, finds his authority eroded. The council, unable to debate or deliberate in the traditional sense, struggles to function. The priest's sermons are gone, replaced by silent gestures during Mass. Poignant, yes, but hardly a platform for intricate policy discussion or resolving complex disputes over property lines or shared resources. So how do you decide who does what? How do you organize the harvest ensuring everyone contributes? How do you fix the bridge when it starts to rot? How do you allocate scarce resources now that the outside trade has dried up? How do you respond if someone breaks one of the village's unspoken rules? These aren't trivial matters. They are the bedrock of survival for your small community. Leadership begins to emerge not through election or inheritance, but through necessity and demonstrated capability. Who is best at communicating through gestures? Who remains calm under pressure, able to patiently work through complex ideas using charades and improvised sign language? Who commands natural respect through their actions, their hard work, their fairness? You might find that someone who was quiet before someone, perhaps overlooked in the boisterous verbal world, now comes into their own. Maybe it's the taciturn farmer who has always understood the land better than anyone and can now guide the planting schedule with precise gestures. Maybe it's the village elder whose wisdom was previously dispensed in slow, deliberate sentences and now manifests as a steady, reassuring presence and clear, simple signs for cooperation. Imagine a village meeting now. It's held in the same place, perhaps the square, or the church hall. People gather, their faces etched with varying degrees of anxiety, hope, and weary determination. Instead of voices, there are hands. Hands shaping ideas in the air, pointing to maps drawn in the dirt, miming actions required, hammering, sewing, digging, fetching water. It's a silent ballet of logistics and survival. Disagreements are still there, of course. Humans are humans with different opinions, needs, and stubborn streaks, voice or no voice. But how do you argue without words? Frustration can boil over, leading to sharp, angry gestures, maybe even physical pushes or shoves, before someone steps in to mediate with calming hands and a steady gaze. Complex issues like dividing the dwindling grain stores for winter become agonizingly difficult to resolve. How do you explain nuances? How do you negotiate? It requires immense patience, a willingness to truly see and interpret others' intentions, and a charitable assumption that disagreement stems from differing needs, not malice. It's like trying to assemble IKEA furniture using only mime. Possible maybe, but definitely going to result in some misplaced parts and a lot of exasperated sighs, or the silent equivalent. The process of collective decision-making becomes incredibly slow and painstaking. Every idea must be demonstrated or drawn. Every objection requires a counter-demonstration. What used to take minutes of verbal back and forth can now take hours of focused, silent effort, often leaving everyone exhausted and emotionally drained. You learn to prioritize the most urgent needs, leaving less critical decisions for later, simply because the energy required to make them is so immense. Rules and justice also evolve. Before, stealing a loaf of bread might have led to a verbal reprimand from the mayor, perhaps a public shaming, or a period in the stocks less common by this era, but you get the idea. Now, identifying a culprit is difficult. Unless caught in the act explaining accusations and alibis, silently is nearly impossible. Punishment is even harder to convey. A silent glare, communal shunning through averted gazes, or perhaps being assigned the hardest, most solitary tasks, become the new forms of consequence. The emphasis shifts from complex legal proceedings to a more immediate, visible form of community disapproval or assignment of penance through labor. It relies heavily on the shared understanding of right and wrong that existed before the silence, hoping that moral norms persist even when the mechanisms for reinforcing them are so hobbled. Mainstream historical fact. Throughout history, particularly in times of crisis or societal breakdown, informal leadership structures often arise alongside or in place of established formal authorities. In communities facing famine, war, or natural disaster, individuals demonstrating resilience, resourcefulness, or the ability to organize others effectively, regardless of their previous status, frequently step up to guide their neighbors. This shift towards practical, action-oriented leadership is a recurring theme in human history during periods of immense pressure. The priest, though silenced, might still retain a form of leadership based on spiritual guidance and his role as a comforter. While he cannot preach his presence at difficult times, his silent blessings and perhaps his continued silent performance of rituals, like burials or marriages, provide a different kind of leadership. A symbolic one anchoring the community to its past and offering solace in the face of despair. His gestures of comfort or encouragement become profoundly powerful because they are delivered in a world starved of easy communication. You learn to read each other with intense focus. Every flicker of the eye, every tension in the shoulders, every subtle hand movement you haven't seen before, you process it all trying to decipher the unspoken message. It's a constant, exhausting act of translation happening in real time 24 hours a day. Your senses, particularly sight and touch, become heightened to compensate for the loss of hearing language. You notice things about your neighbors you never did before. The precise way someone sighs silently, the unique rhythm of their walk, the specific gestures they use to show sadness versus frustration. The concept of charisma takes on a whole new meaning. It's no longer about persuasive speech. It's about the ability to convey clarity and confidence through physical presence and gesture. Someone with clumsy hands and uncertain movements, no matter how intelligent, might struggle to lead, while someone whose signs are clear, decisive, and easy to follow naturally draws others to them. It's like a silent movie where the most effective actors are the ones whose physicality tells the story most clearly. It's a bit like trying to get everyone to agree on pizza toppings when the only options are pineapple or anchovies, and all you can do is make faces. Somebody's going to have to just step up and draw a diagram of a pepperoni pizza and hope for the best. Quirky tidbit. Some historical records describe communities developing rudimentary sign languages under specific circumstances, such as in monasteries where vows of silence were taken or in groups where deaf individuals were concentrated. While these sign languages were developed for communication amongst those who couldn't speak, the idea of a community spontaneously developing a shared visual communication system out of necessity has historical parallels, even if the circumstances of the silent village are unique in their sudden onset and total population effect. Conflict resolution becomes a major challenge. Without the ability to talk things out, misunderstandings can fester. Small slights, which could have been smoothed over with a few words before, now loom large, interpreted through the lens of fear and frustration. Mediation might involve one or two respected individuals patiently working with the disputing parties, using gestures to represent the different sides trying to find common ground through repeated careful demonstrations. It requires a level of empathy and visual communication skill that not everyone possesses. Some disputes might simply remain unresolved, simmering beneath the surface of village life, a silent tension that everyone feels but cannot articulate. Historians still argue whether the silent village's eventual decline was primarily due to external isolation and resource depletion, or if the immense internal strain of constant, difficult nonverbal communication, combined with unresolved conflicts and the psychological toll of silence, ultimately fractured the community's ability to function cohesively, leading to a breakdown in internal leadership and cooperation. Was it the world outside that killed the village? Or did the silence make them unable to survive themselves? The younger generation, those who were children when the silence fell, or who were born into it, might develop more fluid and intuitive sign language skills than their parents, who are constantly translating from the spoken language they remember. These younger villagers might become essential bridges in communication, their innate adaptability, allowing them to express complex ideas more easily than the older generation, who perhaps cling to simpler, more direct forms of gesture. This could potentially lead to a shift in influence, with younger, more gesturally fluent individuals gaining prominence in community decision-making, a silent changing of the guard. Leadership also involves morale. How do you keep hope alive when you can't offer words of encouragement? Leaders learn to use powerful symbolic gestures, a hand on the shoulder, a shared gaze into the distance, a gesture toward the sky or the earth, signifying resilience or continuity. Silent communal activities like working together in the fields or sharing a meal become more important than ever, reinforcing bonds without the need for verbal affirmation. Laughter, though soundless or just a quiet exhalation, becomes a precious commodity, a sign that joy, or at least a grim humor, still exists. You find ways to silently joke, maybe miming someone tripping over a root or making a funny face behind someone's back. It's not Shakespeare, but it's yours. It's like trying to keep a team motivated for a long, arduous hike when all you can do is point at the top of the mountain and give a thumbs up. Hope you packed a really expressive thumb. The responsibility of leadership in the silent village is a crushing burden. These individuals bear the weight of organizing survival, resolving conflict, and maintaining morale, all without the most fundamental tool of human connection and persuasion, the spoken word. They must be constantly on, reading the room, interpreting needs, and conveying direction through sheer physical and emotional clarity. It's a form of leadership born purely from necessity and honed by the brutal constraints of silence, a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, even under the most impossible conditions. As you watch these silent leaders guide your community, you see not just a struggle for survival, but a profound redefinition of what it means to connect, to influence, and to govern. It's a silent, ongoing negotiation for existence played out in gestures, expressions, and the quiet, desperate rhythm of your shared days. And it makes you wonder sometimes if all the talk in the outside world is really any more effective at getting things done or understanding each other than your slow, painstaking efforts. Probably, yeah. But you can dream right. So you've managed to establish a silent, gestural form of leadership, a quiet ballet of survival played out in the village square. Decisions are made slowly and painstakingly through mime and drawing in the dirt. Justice is meted out through silent disapproval and assigned labor. You've become adept at reading the micro-expressions on your neighbors' faces, finding whole conversations hidden in a raised eyebrow or a tightened jaw. It's an exhausting existence, constantly vigilant, constantly interpreting, but you're making it work somehow. But the world outside hasn't forgotten about you entirely, though its attention might feel more like scrutiny than support. News distorted and filtered must surely have leaked out. A village where everyone suddenly stopped talking, that's the kind of story that travels morphing with each retelling, picking up layers of fear and superstition like a snowball rolling downhill. Imagine the rumors reaching the nearest towns, then the regional capital, perhaps even Paris. Whispers of a strange affliction, a divine punishment, a dark curse that struck down the gift of speech. Was it contagious? Was it a plague of the mind? Fear breeds speculation, and speculation breeds avoidance. People in the outside world who rely on spoken language for every transaction, every interaction, every understanding of the world, simply cannot fathom your reality. To them, silence isn't just an absence of sound. It's an absence of sense, an absence of reason, maybe even an absence of humanity as they understand it. And so they fear you. The roads leading to your valley, once dusty tracks occasionally traveled by merchants or visiting relatives, become empty. The few who approach do so with extreme caution, armed, perhaps, certainly wary. They see the silent figures in the fields, the lack of greeting, the unsettling stillness where there should be the sounds of village life. Barking dogs, children playing farmers, shouting to their oxen, women gossiping at the well. It's deeply unnerving to them. It's unnatural. Your attempts to communicate are met with confusion, fear, or outright hostility. Remember the young man who tried to ride to the next town to trade for salt. He was probably stopped by nervous guards or fearful villagers who saw his frantic, voiceless gestures as a sign of madness or aggression. How do you explain your situation without words? How do you convey that you need supplies, that you are simply victims of an inexplicable event, not a threat? Mime works within your shared experience, but trying to explain a metaphysical event, like losing your voice to someone who speaks perfectly fine, is like trying to explain abstract physics to a squirrel using only interpretive dance. It's probably not going to end well for either of you. Perhaps a delegation from the nearest town eventually arrives cautiously. They approach the edge of the village, calling out tentatively. You gather a silent crowd watching them. They try asking questions, their voices echoing strangely in the quiet air. You try to respond with your newfound sign language, pointing to your mouths, making gestures of distress, trying to mime the suddenness of it all. But your gestures are alien to them. They might interpret your pointing as aggression, your miming as mockery, your silence as stubborn refusal or mental deficiency. Their fear solidifies into suspicion. They don't see victims. They see something incomprehensible, something to be contained. The decision is made silently, perhaps on their side, certainly effectively. Your village is to be isolated. A cordon is drawn, perhaps not a physical wall immediately, but a social and economic one. No one is to enter or leave. No goods are to be traded. You are in effect quarantined, not because you have a known contagious disease, but because your very state of being is perceived as a threat, a terrifying unknown. This isolation is devastating. You relied on trade for certain goods. Salt, metal tools, perhaps, seeds or livestock. You didn't raise yourselves. Now that flow stops. Any hope of external aid of doctors who might understand, of priests who might intercede, of authorities who might help, evaporates. You are left entirely to your own devices, cut off from the world you once belonged to. Think about the psychological impact of this. Not only have you lost your voices and your familiar way of life, but now the rest of humanity, the people you are intrinsically connected to, have drawn a line in the sand. They have labeled you other, something to be avoided and feared. It reinforces the sense of being utterly alone, of being abandoned by the world. Some might try to sneak through the cordon, desperate for contact, for help, or simply for supplies. How are they treated? Likely apprehended, turned back, perhaps even met with force, if their silent desperation is interpreted as aggression. Every failed attempt deepens the chasm between your silent world and their speaking one. The authorities might send observers, but they keep their distance, watching your silent struggle with a mixture of fear and scientific curiosity, like observing an ant colony with a peculiar infestation. They take notes, perhaps try to toss messages over the cordon, which are useless if you can't read the language or understand their intent through text alone. They don't offer help, they offer observation. To be studied like a specimen, silent and contained, adds another layer of dehumanization to your plight. It's like trying to explain to your doctor that you've turned purple, and all he does is write it down on a clipboard from across the room, and then slowly back away while making calming hand gestures. Not exactly confidence-inspiring healthcare. Mainstream historical fact. Throughout history, communities perceived as different or afflicted by unknown illnesses or strange behaviors have frequently faced ostracization and isolation from surrounding populations, often based more on fear and misunderstanding than on scientific understanding. Leprosy colonies, quarantine zones during outbreaks, and even the historical treatment of communities with high rates of hereditary conditions that caused unusual physical or mental traits demonstrate this pattern of the unfamiliar being labeled dangerous and then physically or socially walled off. The fear from the outside world isn't entirely baseless from their perspective. They don't know why you are silent. Is it a judgment, a curse? Could it spread? The unknown is terrifying, and your situation is the epitome of the unknown. Their reaction, while devastating to you, is a predictable human response to profound, inexplicable anomaly. They are reacting to their fear, not to your reality. Consider the impact on children born after the silence fell. They grow up never having heard a human voice, except perhaps the muffled sounds of the wind or animals. They learn to communicate purely through gesture, their minds shaped by a silent world. If they were to encounter a speaking person from the outside, that person's voice would be utterly alien and perhaps frightening to them. They are being raised in a different world, creating a further barrier to any future reintegration. It's like trying to introduce someone who grew up only eating food intravenously to the concept of a sandwich. It just wouldn't compute initially. Quirky tidbit. Historically, there are accounts of feral children or individuals raised in extreme isolation who, when later discovered, struggled immensely or were entirely unable to acquire spoken language, particularly if they had passed a critical developmental period. While the villagers weren't raised in isolation from each other, their isolation from spoken language input and interaction with the wider speaking world would create a unique linguistic and cognitive environment, potentially making the acquisition of spoken language later in life incredibly difficult, even if they were somehow cured. The longer this isolation lasts, the more permanent it becomes. The outside world moves on the initial shock and fear, perhaps fading into a grim acceptance of the silent village as a geographical curiosity, a place marked on maps with a silent asterisk. For your part, you learn to rely entirely on yourselves. The idea of help coming from outside diminishes with each passing season of silent crops and silent births and silent deaths. You become fiercely insular, your identity forged in shared silence and shared struggle against both the internal challenge and the external abandonment. The silence becomes a wall, not just within your village, but around it, built by the fear and incomprehension of the speaking world. You are trapped by your silence not just because you cannot speak out, but because the world outside refuses to hear your silent pleas or see your gestural explanations. This reinforces the necessity of your internal adaptations, the development of leadership, the creation of new forms of communication, the reliance on community bonds. Without the possibility of external help, your survival depends entirely on your own ingenuity and resilience. Historians still argue whether the duration and effectiveness of the external quarantine imposed on the village were primarily a result of official government policy enacted out of fear and a desire for containment, or if it was largely a spontaneous grassroots reaction from the surrounding population driven by superstition and a profound inability to empathize with the villagers' condition. Was it state fear or popular fear that truly sealed your fate? The narrative of the silent village circulating in the outside world would become a cautionary tale, a local legend whispered around firesides. It might be used to scare disobedient children. Be good or you'll end up in the silent village. It might be interpreted through religious lenses, a punishment for their sins. It might be dissected by early scientists or philosophers as a strange anomaly, a challenge to their understanding of human nature and language. Your tragedy becomes their story interpreted and distorted, while your lived reality remains locked away behind the silent wall. This external perception, this framing of your village as something strange, perhaps cursed or dangerous, adds another layer of psychological pressure. You are not just dealing with the physical realities of silence and isolation. You are also grappling with the knowledge, however it might reach you, that you are viewed as abnormal, something to be avoided. It's like everyone outside suddenly decided you were all secretly vampires, and they refused to come near you, even in broad daylight. Pretty tough to get a coffee. The attempts to bridge the gap, the desperate gestures towards passing travelers, the signals sent towards the distant towns, the brave souls who tried to venture out. Each failure is a blow to morale. It solidifies the understanding that you are on your own. The world outside doesn't understand, doesn't want to understand, or perhaps cannot understand. Their language of sound and yours of silence have become mutually unintelligible barriers. This isolation, enforced by fear and misunderstanding, shapes the destiny of your village as much as the original event itself. It determines your gene pool, your cultural evolution, or lack thereof in terms of external influence, and limits your access to resources and knowledge. You are forced to become entirely self-sufficient, relying on traditional farming methods, whatever skills existed within the village when the silence fell, and whatever limited resources you can scavenge or create yourselves. The outside world becomes a distant, unattainable place, a memory for the older generation, a myth for the young. Your world shrinks contained within the boundaries of your valley, defined by your shared silence and the speaking world's fear. And as you watch the occasional distant figure turn away from your silent signals or see the wary guards patrolling the roads leading into your territory, you understand perhaps more profoundly than the speaking world ever could the true, isolating power of misunderstanding and the silence it creates between people. So you've been isolated, cut off by the fear and incomprehension of the outside world. The years turn into decades. The initial shock and the desperate attempts to regain speech fade into memory, a story told silently through gesture by the oldest villagers, the last generation who knew sound. For those born after the silence fell, this is simply the way life is. They have never heard a human voice, never known the rumble of conversation, the laughter of children, the shouted commands in the fields, or the quiet murmur of prayers spoken aloud. Imagine the world through the eyes of a child born into this silence. Their cognitive landscape is built on visual cues, on gesture, on expression, on touch. They learn to navigate complex social interactions without a single spoken word. Their understanding of emotion is perhaps even more nuanced than yours was in the noisy world, as they rely entirely on reading faces' body language and the subtle shifts in gestural rhythm. A raised eyebrow is a whole paragraph, a downturned lip, a chapter. They live in a world of heightened visual and somatic awareness. Their language, the one your ancestors began to forge out of necessity, has evolved. It's no longer just a rudimentary tool for survival. It's become a rich, complex sign Language passed down from parent to child. Think about how quickly spoken languages change and adapt over generations. Slang emerges, words shift meaning, new terms are invented. The same happens with sign language. New gestures are created for concepts your ancestors never had to articulate silently. Perhaps there's a complex set of signs for different types of silence. The silence of the forest, the silence of grief, the silence of contemplation. Or maybe a specific sign that means, remember the time before the silence. This new language is not just a collection of hand shapes, it's interwoven with facial expressions, body posture, and spatial grammar. It shapes their very thoughts. How do you think differently when your internal monologue is composed of silent signs rather than sounds? Are concepts processed differently? This is a fascinating if tragic experiment in human cognition unfolding in your isolated valley. The children play silent games, chase each other without shouts, invent stories told entirely through mime and gesture. Their education involves learning the skills needed for survival in the valley, farming, building, crafting, and learning the history of their people. The story of the great silence passed down through generations of silent storytelling. Their lullabies are gentle rocking and comforting touches, their scolding a stern look and sharp, decisive signs. Their connection to the world outside is abstract historical. They might be shown old objects from before the silence. A musical instrument, they can only pluck silently a book they might learn to read if the skill hasn't been lost, but whose words they can never hear spoken. The concept of sound itself must be strange to them. How do you explain what a voice is to someone who has never experienced it? It's like trying to describe the color blue to someone who has only ever seen in black and white. You can talk about vibrations, about air pressure waves, but the subjective experience, the sound of a voice, is utterly foreign. Mainstream historical fact. Languages, including sign languages, are dynamic systems that evolve and change over time through processes like innovation, diffusion, and generational transmission. New words or signs are created, grammar shifts, and dialects emerge in different communities. The sign language developed in your village would inevitably diverge significantly from any pre-existing sign systems and develop its own unique structure and vocabulary over the generations it's used in isolation. As generations pass, the memory of spoken language fades completely. The ability to produce sound, the vocal cords might still be physically capable, but the neurological pathways for speech production and comprehension, never used, might atrophy or simply fail to develop normally. The concept of talking becomes a myth, a strange ability the ancestors had associated with the outside world. The social structure of the village adapts further. Leadership roles become tied to wisdom, experience, and the ability to communicate complex ideas effectively through sign. Disputes are settled through mediated silent discussion, perhaps with designated interpreters who are particularly skilled in the nuances of the village's sign language. Rituals and ceremonies, once perhaps accompanied by chanting or singing, are transformed into silent visual and kinesthetic performances. Weddings are conducted with silent vows, funerals with quiet gestures of mourning. Think about community bonding. Shared silence can be incredibly powerful. While the lack of sound was initially a trauma, the presence of shared silence becomes a defining characteristic, a bond. There might be a deep, unspoken understanding that passes between villagers, a sense of shared experience that transcends the need for words. They read each other's moods not just through expression, but through the energy of their presence, the rhythm of their movements. The concept of noise itself might take on a different meaning. The sounds of nature, the wind, the river, the birds, the animals, are the only natural sounds they know. Human-made sounds would be limited. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of a cart, the rustle of clothes, the sounds of eating. Perhaps they develop a heightened sensitivity to these non-linguistic sounds, finding meaning and comfort in them. A sudden loud noise like thunder or a falling tree might be perceived with intense, almost overwhelming clarity in the absence of competing human sounds. Quirky tidbit. There are documented cases of village sign languages that have developed spontaneously in communities with a high incidence of hereditary deafness, such as Martha's Vineyard in the US historically, or Al Sayed Bedouin Sign Language. These are distinct sign languages developed and used by both deaf and hearing members of the community, demonstrating the human capacity to create complex linguistic systems in different modalities when needed. While the origin of your village's silence is different, a sudden loss of speech rather than congenital deafness, the principle of a new sign language emerging and being passed down through generations is mirrored in these real-world examples. Education of the young is crucial. How do you pass on complex knowledge? Agricultural techniques, building methods, medical remedies, however basic, it's done through demonstration imitation and detailed gestural explanation. The elders, the living libraries of knowledge and history, use their mastery of the village's sign language to instruct the next generation. It's a form of apprenticeship combined with formal silent teaching. Life settles into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the needs of survival. The focus is intensely local. The outside world, if it's thought of at all by the younger generations, is a distant, almost mythical place where people make strange noises with their mouths. There might be cautionary tales about approaching the edge of the valley, reinforced by the lingering fear of the original isolation, and the stories of the few unsuccessful attempts to leave or communicate with outsiders. The concept of identity becomes deeply intertwined with silence. To be a member of the village is to be silent. To speak is to be other part of the world that abandoned you. This shared identity, forged in shared experience and shared silence, is a powerful unifying force. It helps them endure the hardships of isolation and the challenges of their unique existence. Historians still argue whether the development of such a complex, self-contained sign language would have been sufficient for the long-term transmission of all necessary cultural knowledge and technological skills required for the village's survival, or if the inevitable loss of certain information over generations due to the modality shift and isolation would have led to a gradual decline in their capabilities compared to the outside world. Could a silent culture maintain parity and knowledge with a speaking one over centuries? Think about boredom. How do you entertain yourselves in the evenings? Stories told around a fire acted out in gesture. Games that rely on visual cues and physical prowess. Perhaps they develop unique forms of silent music rhythms tapped out or patterns created visually. Their art might focus on sculpture painting or intricate weaving, all forms of expression that don't require sound. The psychological state of the children born into this silence is perhaps different from their ancestors. They didn't experience the loss of voice. They only know the presence of silence. They don't feel the same sense of grief or yearning for spoken sound. For them, the world of noise is an alien concept. This might make them more resilient to their reality, less haunted by what was lost. However, there's still the reality of being different. Even within their own community, there are variations in gestural fluency, in physical ability and personality, just like in any group of people. But the primary differentiator from the rest of humanity is their silence. It's the defining feature both internally and externally. The physical layout of the village might change to facilitate their communication. Wider pathways might be needed to allow groups to walk side by side and sign. Meeting places might be arranged to ensure good sightlines. Perhaps they use visual signals over longer distances, smoke signals, flags, or arrangements of objects. Their architecture might even adapt, incorporating visual elements that convey information or enhance gestural communication. And the outside world continues to exist oblivious or indifferent. Generations are born and die in the world of sound, largely forgetting the silent village or remembering it only as a folktale. They develop technologies you can't even imagine, fight wars you'll never hear about, create art and music that will never reach your ears. Your world remains frozen, or at least evolving, along a completely different trajectory contained within its silent valley. The children growing into adults accept their reality. This is their home, their culture, their language. They teach their own children the silent way of life. The trauma of the original event has receded into the realm of history, leaving behind a unique society shaped and defined by the absence of sound, a living testament to human adaptability, resilience, and the profound impact of language even in its absence. They are the silent inheritors of a silent land, navigating a world where gesture is thought and expression is seen, living their lives in the quiet echo of a history they only know through the movements of hands and the expressions on faces. It's a strange, poignant existence, one that perhaps allows for a deeper connection in some ways, but forever separates them from the vast, noisy current of human history. flowing just beyond their silent valley. And while your descendants in the valley are mastering the nuances of silent grammar and learning to read the world through visual cues, the great noisy current of human history rushes onward outside the valley walls. Time, which seems to move at a different pace in your quiet refuge, accelerates elsewhere. The seasons still turn, the sun still rises and sets, but the way people live the things, they build the speed at which they move and communicate. All of this transforms with astonishing rapidity, a transformation you remain blissfully unaware of, or at best dimly aware of, through distorted, long-forgotten tales. Decades pass, then centuries. The simple cottages of wood and stone in your valley remain much the same, perhaps repaired and rebuilt in the traditional, silent ways. Outside villages grow into towns, towns into cities. Horses and carts, the fastest transport your ancestors knew, give way to steam engines, then internal combustion engines, then airplanes. Imagine trying to describe a train to someone who has only ever seen a horse, and you have to do it entirely through mime. It would be like trying to explain the internet using interpretive dance. Okay, so it's this hand-wavy, motion buzzing noise mime cry that connects, two hands linking then expanding outward. Everything, sweeping arm gesture across the horizon, but you can't touch it. Hands recoil sharply, and it has pictures of cats, miming cat whiskers. Good luck with that. The world of sound your ancestors knew becomes a world of increasing mechanical noise. The gentle clatter of a blacksmith's forge is drowned out by the roar of factories. The quiet chatter of markets is replaced by the din of traffic. Voices, once the primary mode of communication, are amplified, transmitted over wires, then through the air. The very texture of the outside world's soundscape changes utterly. Your valley, in contrast, remains an acoustic anomaly, a pocket of profound, unchanging silence. The knowledge held by the outside world expands exponentially. Science progresses from theories about humors to understanding DNA. Philosophy grapples with industrialization and existentialism. Art explores impressionism, cubism, abstract expressionism, while in your valley, perhaps painting still depicts simplified forms, focused on the familiar landscapes and the human figures of your silent community. They paint what they see, not what they hear or feel through spoken language. Your village, once a specific, albeit horrifying event, fades into the realm of local folklore, a cautionary tale, or a spooky story told around campfires to frighten children. Watch out, or you'll end up like the silent folk of the valley. Most people outside forget the precise details, or even if it was real at all. It becomes a myth, a whispered legend, perhaps embellished with fantastical details over the generations. Tales of people turning to stone, or communicating with animals, or having eyes that could see into your soul because they couldn't talk. Occasionally someone does stumble too close, perhaps a lost traveler, a curious explorer, or later a surveyor mapping the wilderness. They see the smoke from chimneys, signs of habitation. As they approach, they are met not with shouts or barks of guard dogs, but with silence. Figures emerge, watching them with intense, unreadable expressions. Gestures are made, perhaps warning gestures or signs of confusion, or even attempts to communicate in a way the outsider cannot comprehend. The outsider, unnerved by the utter silence, the strange language of the hands. The difference in the people's demeanor, usually retreats, reporting back tales of a strange, silent community, further solidifying the legend rather than revealing the truth. Imagine the awkwardness. You try to shout a greeting, maybe ask for directions, and they just stare, then start doing, well, what looks like really involves charades. You'd probably back away slowly too, feeling like you'd accidentally wandered onto the set of a very avant-garde, very quiet theater performance. The outside world fights wars on scales your ancestors couldn't have conceived. Global conflicts involving millions. Nations rise and fall. Political systems shift from monarchies to republics, to empires, to democracies, to dictatorships. None of this turmoil penetrates the quiet serenity of your valley. Your village governance, whatever form it took, likely remains stable, evolving slowly within its isolated microcosm, untouched by external ideologies or conflicts. The concept of nations or borders or political parties, would be utterly foreign, perhaps represented by abstract, incomprehensible signs in the silent history lessons. Mainstream historical fact. The period roughly from the mid-18th century through the 20th century saw unprecedented technological advancement and societal change driven by the Industrial Revolution and subsequent waves of innovation. This included the development of steam power electricity, mass production, internal combustion engines, telecommunications, and modern medicine, fundamentally transforming daily life economies and global interactions at a pace never before seen in human history. This era of rapid change provides a stark contrast to the relative stability of a completely isolated pre-industrial community. Think about health. While the outside world battles diseases with vaccines and antibiotics, your village relies on traditional remedies, hygiene practices passed down silently, and perhaps a degree of natural selection ensuring the survival of the hardiest. A simple illness that is easily cured in the outside world might remain a significant threat in your valley. Conversely, they are spared the epidemics that sweep through interconnected populations. It's a different set of vulnerabilities and resiliencies. The outside world develops mass media, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and eventually the internet. Information and ideas spread globally, creating shared cultures and global awareness or global misinformation. Your village, meanwhile, communicates face-to-face or within sight range, sharing information through gesture and expression. Their collective knowledge is limited to what can be remembered, taught, and passed down within their small silent community. They have no concept of events happening across oceans, no knowledge of other civilizations, no exposure to different ways of thinking or living beyond their valley walls. Their worldview is intensely, perhaps even claustrophobically local. Quirky tidbit. During the age of exploration and colonization, many remote or previously unknown communities were discovered by outsiders, leading to cultural exchange, conflict, or sometimes devastating disease transmission. The relative lack of successful contact with your silent village despite centuries passing suggests its location must be particularly remote, its inhabitants particularly wary, or perhaps fate simply kept the major currents of exploration and development flowing around it. There are real historical examples of lost tribes or isolated groups maintaining their distinct cultures for extended periods due to geographical isolation. The concept of progress itself would be perceived differently. In the outside world, progress is often measured by technological advancement, economic growth, increasing speed and connectivity. In your silent valley, progress might be measured by the richness and complexity of their sign language, the success of a harvest, the health of the community, the depth of understanding passed between generations. Progress is internal, communal, and perhaps slower, more incremental. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of being completely cut off from the broader sweep of human development, while perhaps preserving a unique cultural form, would ultimately be detrimental to the long-term well-being and adaptability of an isolated community compared to one integrated into the wider world. Does isolation protect, or does it ultimately limit potential? Imagine the quiet nights in your valley. No distant sound of trains or cars, no hum of electricity, no chatter from late-night establishments. Only the sounds of nature, wind-water animals, and the shared silence of the villagers. The stars overhead would be brighter, unobscured by city lights. This deep connection to the natural world, unmediated by the constant noise and distractions of modern life, might be another defining characteristic of their existence. The outside world in its hubris might assume that a community without spoken language is primitive or less intelligent. They might not understand the sophisticated linguistic structure of the village sign language, mistaking it for simple mime. This misunderstanding, coupled with the silence, would only reinforce the perception of otherness and perhaps the desire to leave the strange silent folk alone. You wouldn't even know how to begin explaining quantum physics or reality television using only hand gestures, though explaining reality television through mime might actually be an improvement. The global population explodes, reaching billions. The outside world becomes increasingly crowded, interconnected, and fast-paced. Resources are consumed at an ever-increasing rate. Environmental impacts become a major concern. Your village, with its small, stable population and sustainable low-tech lifestyle, exists in stark contrast to this global reality. They might be more in tune with their local environment, more dependent on its health than their noisy industrialized counterparts. Perhaps there are rare moments of indirect interaction. A few objects from the outside world find their way into the valley. A dropped tool, a piece of discarded packaging, carried by the wind, something found near the valley's edge. These objects would be strange alien artifacts, remnants of a mysterious world that makes noise and moves at impossible speeds. What would your descendants make of a simple plastic bottle or a piece of printed paper with words they can't read and a purpose they can't guess? Would they become revered objects, symbols of the lost world? The silent generations continue to live, love, work and die in their valley, their history accumulating not in written records or oral traditions, but in the memories passed down through silent storytelling, in the techniques preserved through demonstration, and in the language itself, which carries the history of their adaptation and resilience within its evolving structure. They are a living archive, but one that requires initiation into their unique mode of communication to access. So while empires rise and fall, continents are explored and exploited, and humanity reaches for the stars in a cacophony of progress and conflict, your descendants live on in their quiet corner of the world, a silent footnote in the roaring epic of human history, largely forgotten, but perhaps in their own way having found a form of peace and continuity that the ever-changing noisy world outside can only dream of. They are the guardians of silence, living proof that human connection and culture can flourish even when the most fundamental tool of human interaction, spoken language, is lost. And so centuries drift by like dust motes in the sunlight of your quiet valley. The outside world roars and changes, a blur of technological revolutions and global upheavals you perceive only as the faintest, most confusing echoes, if at all. But the outside world keeps expanding its reach, stretching into every corner, propelled by curiosity, technology, and sheer population growth. Wilderness areas shrink, maps become more detailed, and the likelihood of your isolated valley remaining hidden forever diminishes with every passing decade of the 20th and 21st centuries. Picture it, the outside world is now a place of humming electricity, of metal birds slicing through the sky, of tiny boxes that hold all the knowledge of humanity and connect people across vast distances with silent signals. You, meanwhile, might be tending your garden, communicating with your neighbor through a graceful dance of hands, your world contained within the familiar rhythm of seasons and the quiet life of the community. And then one day, they come. Who are they? Perhaps it's a team of surveyors using GPS and laser rangefinders to map previously inaccessible terrain. Perhaps it's a group of adventurous hikers drawn by rumors of a lost valley. Maybe it's even a scientific expedition tipped off by strange anomalies in satellite imagery, unusual patterns of habitation in a place previously marked as uninhabited, or maybe something as simple as seeing faint trails that shouldn't be there on a detailed topographical scan. However they arrive, their presence shatters the ancient silence. You first become aware of them not by sound, though the noise they bring will eventually be overwhelming, but by sight. A glint of metal high on a distant ridge, a splash of bright, unnatural color against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. Then maybe a tiny buzzing sound that grows louder, a drone hovering like some strange mechanical insect, observing your village from above. Your community, honed by generations of living in silent vigilance, notices these intrusions immediately. Signals pass swiftly through the village, not spoken words, but rapid, complex sequences of gestures, expressions, and body movements. Curiosity, caution perhaps, fear ripple through the silent crowd that gathers to watch the invaders from afar. Imagine the outsider's perspective. They arrive expecting empty wilderness, maybe a few signs of ancient ruins, and instead they find a village, a seemingly pre-industrial village tucked away in a fold of the mountains. But then they notice the silence. No barking dogs as they approach, no voices calling out challenges or greetings, just people watching them. And as they get closer, they see the hands moving, the expressive faces, the utter profound absence of sound. It's not just quiet, it's actively silent, a silence that feels deliberate, unnerving. They try to speak. "Hello, is anyone there? We mean no harm." And in their voices echo oddly in the stillness, met only by more silent stares, more intricate hand movements they cannot understand. This is where the culture clash becomes palpable, even without sound. The outsiders, used to a world saturated with noise and rapid-fire verbal communication, feel disoriented, frustrated, perhaps even a little frightened. They might try exaggerated gestures, miming eating and drinking, pointing to themselves in the village. Simple universal actions. And your descendants, masters of a far more sophisticated visual language, might watch these clumsy attempts with a mixture of pity, confusion, and perhaps a touch of silent amusement. It's like trying to have a philosophical debate using only kindergarten flashcards. You hungry want, apple, outsider mimes eating. Your descendant might respond with a complex series of hand shapes and facial expressions that convey, "We appreciate your rudimentary efforts, but your lack of linguistic nuance is frankly astounding. Please clarify your intention specifically regarding duration of stay and purpose of photographic documentation." All communicated in the blink of an eye through movement. Mainstream historical fact. The 20th and 21st centuries saw significant advancements in anthropology and linguistics, including the study and documentation of previously unknown or isolated cultures and languages, often raising complex ethical questions about contact and preservation. The concept of uncontacted peoples is a real phenomenon, though increasingly rare, and their interactions with the outside world are often fraught with difficulty and unintended consequences, particularly concerning health and cultural integrity. Attempts are made to bridge the gap. The outsiders, if they are scientists or linguists, might recognize that this is not just random gesturing, but a structured language. They might try to learn, perhaps using visual aids or trying to decipher patterns. Imagine the painstaking process, pointing to objects, trying to mimic signs, making mistakes, and slowly, glacially beginning to grasp the grammar and vocabulary of this ancient, silent tongue. It would be a monumental linguistic puzzle unlike any other, a language shaped by centuries of silent adaptation. Quirky tidbit. Some researchers studying modern sign languages have found that their grammatical structures can differ significantly from spoken languages, sometimes incorporating spatial information or using simultaneous expressions, hand-shape movement, facial expression in ways that are impossible in linear speech. The silent village's language, developing in complete isolation, would likely have evolved unique features reflecting its origins and the specific needs of its community, potentially offering unprecedented insights into the nature of language itself, independent of sound. The ethical dilemmas are immense. Should this community, which has preserved its unique culture and found a way to thrive in silence for generations, be integrated into the modern world? What are the risks? Exposure to diseases they have no immunity to, disruption of their social structure, the potential loss of their unique language and way of life in the face of overwhelming external influence. Historians still argue whether the benefits of contact and access to modern resources and knowledge outweigh the risks of cultural erosion and the potential harm to isolated populations. Is it better to preserve them as a unique cultural artifact or offer them the advancements of the modern world, however disruptive? Perhaps some villagers are curious about the outside world, drawn by the strange objects, the glimpses of technology. Others might be deeply wary, understanding instinctively that this contact threatens their existence. Factions might form within the community, silent arguments raging through expressive gestures about the best course of action. The arrival of the outside world isn't just a scientific event, it's a profound social and existential crisis for your descendants. The sounds the outsiders bring, the roar of engines, the constant chatter of their voices, the blare of their electronic devices, would be a physical assault on senses honed by generations of silence. Imagine experiencing decades, centuries, even of relative quiet, broken only by nature, and then suddenly being plunged into the cacophony of modern life. It would be disorienting, painful, perhaps even physically sickening. You'd probably want to cover your ears, except covering your hands would make it hard to talk. A truly silent dilemma. If the outsiders are benevolent, they might try to establish a protected zone, study the village respectfully, and offer assistance cautiously. If they are less scrupulous, the village could be exploited, turned into a tourist attraction. Come see the silent people, or their land and resources taken. The history of contact between technological societies and isolated communities is unfortunately often a grim one. Even well-intentioned contact is complicated. How do you explain abstract modern concepts, like nations' money technology beyond simple tools or complex scientific ideas, using only gestures and visual aids to people whose worldview is shaped by centuries of silent, isolated existence? It would require inventing entirely new signs expanding their already complex language at an unprecedented rate, or finding non-linguistic ways to share information, like showing them videos or demonstrating technology directly. Imagine trying to explain cryptocurrency using only charades. Okay, so it's money, mime counting cash, but not real, shake head, on a computer, mime typing, maybe in the clouds, point up look confused, and it goes up and down like this hand roller coaster motion. Yeah, good luck investing after that explanation. The rediscovery, whenever and however it happens, marks the end of your descendants' unique, isolated history. Whether they integrate, are protected, or exploited, their story becomes entwined with the broader, noisy narrative of the outside world. The silence that defined them for generations is broken not just by the sounds the outsiders bring, but by the inevitable questions, conflicts, and changes that contact with a vastly different civilization imposes. Their valley is no longer just their home. It is now a point of fascination, a scientific marvel, an ethical challenge, a potential tourist trap, or maybe all of these things at once. The long, quiet dream of isolation is replaced by the complex, noisy reality of the modern world. The quiet, which had been a subtle character in the village drama, now starts to become the protagonist. It wraps around everything, a heavy blanket, smothering the usual sounds of life. Remember the lively chatter in the market, the shouts of children playing the rhythm of work songs. They are gone, replaced by hesitant whispers, frustrated grunts, and long, awkward silences. You walk through the streets, and instead of greetings, you get wary nods, quick glances away. The shared burden of this strange affliction starts to fracture the very bonds it initially highlighted. Fear is a corrosive acid, and it works quickly on community solidarity when the threat is invisible and poorly understood. Initially, there was sympathy, a shared concern for neighbors. But as the problem persists and no remedies work, that sympathy curdles into fear. Fear of catching it, fear of being associated with it, fear of what it means. You see people cross the street when they see someone known to be severely affected. Conversations stop abruptly when one of them approaches. Whispers, if the speakers can manage them, follow in their wake. It's a subtle, painful shunning at first, a turning away rather than an outright confrontation. The village, once a tight-knit unit, begins to stratify. There are those who seem unaffected, or only mildly so. They form a nervous, increasingly isolated core. Then there are those in the middle, struggling more often than not, their speech unpredictable. And finally, there are the most severely affected, those for whom even simple words are a monumental effort, if they can speak at all. It's these last individuals that the fear focuses on. They become visible symbols of the terrifying unknown, walking reminders of what might happen to anyone. People start looking for explanations, and in the absence of scientific understanding, old fears resurface. Was it a curse? Had someone angered God? Was there a witch in the village? You might hear hushed accusations, veiled suspicions, pointed at individuals who were already a little different. Perhaps the old woman who lived alone, or the newcomer who arrived last spring. This is a mainstream historical fact throughout history. Communities facing inexplicable misfortune, especially illness or social breakdown, have often resorted to blaming marginalized individuals or groups, leading to persecution and scapegoating. The inability to communicate effectively makes the affected individuals even more vulnerable, less able to defend themselves against baseless accusations. The isolation intensifies. Affected individuals find themselves excluded from social gatherings. The communal baking oven, where women would gather to chat while their bread cooked, becomes a place of strained silence, with those who struggle to speak subtly, or not so subtly, discouraged from lingering. Men gathering for a drink at the tavern find the easy camaraderie replaced by a watchful tension, the flow of conversation constantly interrupted by frustrating pauses. Those who can still speak fluidly start to keep their distance from those who can't. A tragic irony where the very people who need support the most are pushed away. You see children being pulled closer to their parents when someone with hesitant speech walks by their innocent questions, silenced by a parent's anxious grip. It reaches a point where the fear becomes a tangible barrier. Some families start keeping their most affected members at home out of sight, perhaps partly out of shame, partly out of a misguided attempt to protect them from judgment, but also increasingly because the community pressure makes their presence unwelcome. There might be attempts to create physical separation. Perhaps the affected are subtly directed towards certain paths or areas of the village. A quirky tidbit might emerge. Maybe someone suggests wearing a specific colored ribbon or carrying a particular stone to identify the afflicted, supposedly for mutual aid, but really for avoidance. Or maybe a strange local ordinance appears forbidding those who cannot speak clearly from entering the church or the market square. Imagine trying to enforce such a rule, a surreal pantomime of authority and confusion, adding another layer of absurdity to the tragedy. You see the heartbreak in the eyes of those being pushed away. The confusion, the hurt, the profound loneliness of being among your own people, yet feeling utterly alien. They can see the fear, feel the avoidance, but struggle to vocalize their pain, their protest. It's a silent scream that hangs in the air, thick with sorrow. The village isn't just losing its voice, it's losing its heart, its sense of shared humanity, replaced by suspicion and division. Historians still argue whether this isolation was primarily a conscious act of exclusion, driven by fear, or an almost inevitable consequence of the inability to participate in a language-based society, rendering the affected functionally isolated, regardless of community intent. Was it active cruelty or passive, systemic breakdown? The line feels blurry when you see a farmer refuse to sell grain to a neighbor. He's known his whole life simply because the neighbor can no longer form the words to complete the transaction properly, or when children are forbidden from playing with others whose speech is too garbled. The silence grows, but it's not peaceful. It's a silence filled with tension, with unspoken accusations, with the sound of doors closing and footsteps hurrying away. The fabric of the community, once woven together by threads of shared words and understanding, is now being systematically unraveled by fear, leaving behind isolated fraying strands. And you, watching from the periphery, feel the chill of that fear, wondering not just how they will live without language, but how they will survive without connection. The village that sang and spoke and argued and gossiped is becoming a collection of islands, adrift in a sea of fear and silence. The quiet is no longer just an absence of sound. It's an active presence, a force driving people apart. The quiet, remember, wasn't just an internal problem for the village anymore. It had become a strange, unnerving anomaly that occasionally brushed against the outside world. Maybe it was a merchant who tried to trade for eggs and received only shrugs and confused gestures, leaving bewildered and a little unnerved. Perhaps it was a distant relative who came to visit and found their family eerily silent, communicating in halting, broken phrases or just sad, expressive eyes. The stories like ripples from a stone dropped in a pond began to spread. They were strange stories, hard to believe. A village where people forgot how to talk. Sounds like something out of a fairy tale, or maybe a really boring curse. Now, you can imagine someone saying in a tavern miles away, probably just a bad harvest making them surly. But the stories persisted. They became more detailed, more consistent. People weren't just surly, they were genuinely struggling to form words. A government official passing through on unrelated business might have stopped for directions and found himself facing a wall of silence and apologetic, frustrated hand movements. He'd returned to the regional capital with a report that sounded frankly ridiculous, but multiple ridiculous reports from different sources eventually start to raise eyebrows. Maybe it's not just surliness. Maybe something genuinely weird is happening out there. So inevitably, the outside world decides to send someone to investigate. You can almost picture the scene, a small delegation, perhaps a couple of minor officials from the nearest town, accompanied by a physician, maybe someone recommended for their open mind, or maybe just because they drew the short straw. They arrive not in a gleaming modern car, obviously, but likely in a dusty carriage rattling down the rough track, leading to the village, the rhythmic clatter of hooves and wheels, a stark contrast to the unsettling silence that has settled over the place. They are expecting what an epidemic, a political uprising, a religious fanaticism. They are certainly not expecting functional, healthy-looking people who simply cannot hold a coherent conversation. Their arrival causes a stir, of course. The villagers, wary and isolated, emerge to watch the carriage pull into the square. There's a flicker of something in their eyes. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just suspicion of outsiders, which is a fairly common historical stance for isolated communities, mainstream historical fact right there. The officials disembark, straightening their coats, looking official and slightly apprehensive. The physician, with his bag of instruments and remedies, looks around with a clinical eye, probably already formulating differential diagnoses in his head. He's thinking fever contagion, perhaps some kind of local poison. He is not thinking about the profound, terrifying weirdness he is about to encounter. The first attempts at communication are difficult. The officials, used to being greeted with deference and requests, try to ask questions. What is the nature of your distress? They might inquire in formal, important-sounding language. They are met with blank stares, fumbling attempts at response words dissolving before they can be fully formed. Imagine trying to explain to someone who has lost their language that you are a doctor and you are here to help. You might gesture, point to yourself, point to them, make reassuring noises. They look back with a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension, their faces etched with weariness and the frustration you've seen so often. The physician sets up a makeshift examination area, maybe in the village hall or the church annex. He examines people. He checks their pulses, looks at their tongues, asks them to describe their symptoms. And this is where the bizarre nature of the affliction becomes glaringly obvious to the outsiders. The patients are physically healthy. No fever, no rash, no obvious signs of illness. Yet when asked to say their name, they might produce only a garbled sound or a single syllable or just a look of intense, desperate struggle. It's like their minds know the words, but the connection to their mouths has been severed by some invisible force. The doctors are baffled. They've never seen anything like it. They consult their medical texts, scratch their heads. They try remedies that might work for neurological conditions, for fevers, for hysteria. They might administer tonics, purgatives, perhaps even try bleeding, because historically, when doctors didn't know what was wrong, bleeding was often on the table. You can almost hear the internal monologue of one of these physicians. Patient appears, hail pulse strong. Perhaps a buildup of humors causing blockage of the vocal passages. A good bleeding might restore flow. A quirky tidbit for you medical history is full of treatments that seem utterly bonkers in retrospect, like using crushed pearls or dried toad for various ailments. Trying to cure mutism with leeches feels right at home. These attempted cures, of course, have no effect. The villagers remain largely silent, their communication abilities unchanged. The frustration of the outsiders mounts. They came expecting a straightforward medical problem, something they could diagnose and treat with their existing knowledge. Instead, they've stumbled into a linguistic and psychological twilight zone. How do you treat an illness that defies all known categories? They start talking amongst themselves using words like malady, affliction, maybe even madness. There's a real risk here of the villagers being simply dismissed as mentally ill rather than suffering from something genuinely unique and perhaps collective. The communication breakdown works both ways, making the investigation incredibly difficult. The doctors can't get detailed histories from the patients. They can't understand the nuances of what the villagers are able to communicate through gesture or fragmented speech. The villagers, in turn, can't understand the complex medical explanations or instructions being given to them. It's a dialogue of the deaf played out in frustrated silence and bewildered stares. Imagine trying to explain a complex treatment plan to someone who can only respond with a pained nod and a single whispered yes or no. It would be exhausting for everyone involved. The officials, meanwhile, are concerned with the administrative aspect. How can this village function? Taxes need to be collected, disputes need to be resolved, communication needs to happen with the regional capital. A village that can't talk is a bureaucratic nightmare. They might try setting up systems based on written communication, but many villagers would be illiterate or find writing just as difficult as speaking. They might try using unaffected individuals as intermediaries, but as you saw in the last section, those individuals are becoming increasingly isolated themselves, or perhaps are now seen with suspicion by the authorities. Why can you still speak fluently, eh? Are you somehow immune, or worse, are you causing this? There's also the simple human aspect. Imagine being one of these outsiders arriving full of confidence, ready to solve the problem, only to be met with such profound, unyielding strangeness. The silence gets to you. It's not just quiet, it's an active absence of void where sound and connection should be. You see the fear in the villagers' eyes, but also the fear in your own reflection. What if this is contagious? Not just the inability to speak, but the fear itself, the breakdown of order. The officials might find themselves speaking in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders, starting to feel the weight of the village's silent burden. Historians still argue whether the initial reaction of external authorities to inexplicable social or medical phenomena in pre-modern times was primarily one of genuine scientific inquiry, limited as that might have been, or driven more by a need to restore order and control, often resorting to established but ineffective methods. Was it about healing or about containment and control? In this village, you see elements of both playing out simultaneously. The doctor wants to understand and cure the official, wants the village to function normally again. But neither is equipped for the fundamental challenge this poses. Attempts to impose structure on the communication chaos might lead to some genuinely bizarre situations. Maybe the officials declare that all village business must now be conducted through charades, leading to frustrating and often hilarious misunderstandings over property lines or livestock sales. A light joke. "So you want to sell me 5 chickens?" says the official, miming chickens scratching the ground. The villager responds with an elaborate series of gestures involving a pig and a broken fence. "Ah," nods the official sagely, "5 chickens, and you need help repairing your pigsty." The villagers would likely respond with blank stares or sighs, wishing they could just say, "No, you utter imbecile, I want to trade these 5 chickens for your pig, because mine broke its leg, falling into the ditch you refuse to fix." The presence of the outsiders also changes the internal dynamic of the village. Some villagers cling to them as saviors bringing hope and resources. Others resent their intrusion, their inability to understand their sometimes heavy-handed attempts to fix things they don't comprehend. There might be quiet acts of defiance, villagers deliberately making no attempt to communicate with the officials, turning their backs, retreating into their silent world. The arrival of the external world hasn't necessarily unified the village. It might have just introduced new lines of tension on top of the existing ones caused by fear and isolation. The doctors might eventually give up on conventional medicine and turn to other explanations. Perhaps it's spiritual. They might consult local priests or even exorcists if the phenomenon starts being framed in terms of possession or divine punishment. Imagine the scene: a priest sprinkling holy water and intoning prayers while villagers look on with a mixture of hope and skepticism, unable to articulate their feelings about the ritual. The quirky tidbit here could be about one specific local cure attempted. Maybe boiling stones in milk and having people drink it, or wrapping the affected in specific herbs while reciting ancient rhymes. Anything strange enough to feel like a desperate last-ditch effort when logic has failed. You witness the growing despair of the outsiders, their initial confidence eroding, replaced by frustration and a creeping sense of helplessness. They are faced with a problem that doesn't fit their maps of the world, a crisis of communication in its purest, most debilitating form. They can't talk to the people, and the people can't talk to them or each other effectively. The village in its silence is resisting their efforts to understand and control it, not out of malice, but simply because the fundamental tool of interaction is broken. The carriage that arrived with hope and authority now seems to stand as a symbol of their inability to penetrate the silent wall. They came to fix the voice, but found that the problem was deeper embedded in the very fabric of the community and the human need for connection through language. And as they pack their bags defeated, you realize their departure will leave the village just as silent, just as isolated, but perhaps now with the added burden of knowing that even the outside world has no answers. A final light joke, perhaps. One of the officials sighs, watching a villager mime vigorously towards a chicken. "Well," he mutters, "at least they'll never run out of material for charades night." It's a dark joke reflecting the grim reality. The carriage rumbled away, disappearing back down the dusty track that led to the world of noise and conversation. The officials, defeated and baffled, took with them their useless medical bags, their frustrated reports, and the heavy silence they couldn't comprehend, let alone cure. You watch them go, feeling a strange mix of relief. The pressure of being observed is gone, and a profound sense of abandonment. They had come full of bluster and supposed solutions, and left having changed nothing except perhaps to highlight just how deep and impenetrable the problem was. The silence they left behind felt heavier than before, no longer just the absence of sound, but the confirmation of isolation. The village was truly alone with its affliction now. So you are left here in the quiet. The brief flicker of hope that the outsiders represented is extinguished, replaced by the dull, persistent ache of reality. How do you live in a world without words? How do you manage the mundane, the essential tasks that require communication? The rhythm of the village doesn't stop, not completely. The sun still rises and sets, the crops still need tending. The animals still need feeding. But everything is harder, slower, fraught with potential misunderstanding. Simple instructions become elaborate, frustrating pantomimes. Go fetch the bucket by the well now requires pointing, miming the action of drawing water, making the shape of a bucket with your hands. Imagine trying to negotiate the price of a chicken or settle a dispute over a property line with only shrugs and gestures. It's less like diplomacy, more like a particularly confusing game of charades where the stakes are your livelihood and your relationships. The social fabric, already strained by fear and isolation, continues to fray. Without the easy flow of gossip, comfort, and shared laughter that language provides, bonds weaken. Arguments erupt in frustrated shouts or tense, silent standoffs impossible to resolve when explanations and apologies cannot be articulated. People retreat further into themselves, their homes, their small family units, if those units are even still functioning. Remember the earlier signs of suspicion, the quiet accusations. Without the ability to talk things out, those suspicions fester, growing into resentment and fear. It's easy to imagine a villager seeing their neighbor struggling to express something and thinking, are they doing this deliberately? Are they pretending? Or are they truly broken? Daily tasks that were once simple collaborative efforts become individual battles. Fetching water, grinding grain, mending fences. These require coordination discussion. How do you plan the planting season without talking? How do you organize a communal barn raising? The village relies on cooperation for survival, but cooperation relies on communication. The silence isn't just an inconvenience, it's an existential threat to the community itself. It's like trying to build a house with everyone holding a hammer, but unable to agree on which nail to hit first, or even what a nail is. A dark joke, yes, but the reality is likely just as bleak. Children are the most tragic figures in this silent world. Babies are born knowing only cries and the silent comfort of their parents. As they grow, they don't hear the stories, the songs, the endless stream of language that shapes a developing mind. They might pick up on gestures, learn to interpret facial expressions with uncanny accuracy, but they are denied the fundamental tool of human connection and cognition. Imagine trying to teach a child about the world, about history, about morality, about their own identity, without words. You point, you show, you demonstrate, but the richness, the nuance, the abstract concepts that language unlocks are lost. They might grow up with a deep, unfillable void, a perpetual state of being on the edge of understanding, without ever fully grasping the human experience as we know it. And what about the few who retain some language? Do they become leaders? Or are they resented, ostracized, feared? Do they try desperately to communicate with the outside world only to be dismissed? Do they eventually succumb to the surrounding silence, their own linguistic abilities atrophying from lack of use? It's a lonely fate to be the only voice in a world that cannot hear or respond in kind. Their knowledge, their memories, the history they carry, it all risks being lost, locked away inside minds that have no outlet for expression in their own community. Over time, the village would likely shrink. Trade becomes too difficult, life too arduous, hope too scarce. Those who can leave probably do, fleeing the suffocating silence for places where human connection is still possible. Perhaps they carry with them fragmented memories, whispers of a strange place where words died. The buildings fall into disrepair, roofs, sag, fields turn wild. The paths become overgrown. The sounds of life, laughter shouting the rhythm of work and conversation, are replaced by the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the wind whistling through empty doorways. The silence starts to reclaim the space, not just internally, but physically. The story of the silent village wouldn't be widely known, not in detail. There would be no written records from the villagers themselves, of course. The few outsider accounts, The bewildered merchant, the frustrated official, the baffled doctor would be disjointed, speculative, perhaps dismissed as local folklore or an exaggeration of some minor illness or social problem. In an era without mass communication, a strange event in a remote village could easily sink beneath the surface of history, leaving barely a ripple. Mainstream historical fact, the vast majority of local events and individual experiences in pre-modern Europe went unrecorded in official histories, leaving enormous gaps in our understanding of daily life and unusual occurrences outside major urban centers or political events. So the village becomes a footnote, a rumor, a local legend whispered around firesides, maybe distorted and embellished with each retelling until it becomes something entirely different. A tale of a curse of mad villagers, of a place haunted by its own lack of sound. The specific details, the human cost, the slow, agonizing decline of a community stripped of its voice, that fades away lost in the mists of time, in poor record-keeping. The precise location might even be forgotten or merge with other stories of abandoned settlements. Historians still argue whether isolated incidents like this, assuming they occurred, represent genuine collective psychosomatic phenomena, a rare environmental trigger affecting neurology, or perhaps a consequence of extreme social and psychological stress manifesting physically. Was it something in the water, something in the air, or something purely of the mind amplified by the claustrophobia of community and fear? The debate remains open largely because the evidence is so scarce and ambiguous. A quirky tidbit related to this obscurity, one persistent but unverified rumor, speaks of a strange iridescent moss that grew only in the ruined foundations of the silent village, said to cause vivid dreams or temporary amnesia if touched. Probably just folklore, but it adds to the mystery, doesn't it? The story, therefore, isn't just about a village that forgot how to speak. It's about the fundamental human need for language, the intricate web of connection, identity, and shared reality that words weave. Without them, that web unravels, leaving individuals isolated, communities broken, and history itself fragmented and silent. You realize that the greatest silence isn't just the absence of sound, but the absence of shared meaning, the inability to connect our inner worlds with the outer one and with each other. And perhaps in the end, the silence becomes total. Not just the absence of speech, but the absence of people. The village returns to the earth, its stone walls crumbling its fields, merging back into the surrounding landscape, remembered only in fading whispers, or not at all. The wind blows through the empty spaces where homes once stood, carrying no voices, only the sounds of nature, reclaiming what was lost. The story becomes part of the quiet itself, a mystery buried beneath years of silence, leaving you with the unsettling thought that sometimes the most profound events leave no trace. No record, only the echo of an absence. It's a heavy thought, isn't it? The idea of a place where language simply evaporated. Makes you appreciate the simple act of talking, doesn't it? Even boring conversations feel like a miracle compared to that profound, terrifying quiet. Well, that was quite the journey, wasn't it? Through the dust and the silence, the fear and the mystery. You traveled there in your mind, saw the struggles, felt the frustration, witnessed the slow fade of a community losing its voice. Now let that image soften, blur around the edges. The dust settles, the silence becomes less sharp, less heavy. It's just quiet. The wind outside is just the wind. The hum of your fan, the beat of your heart, the gentle sounds of your own space are the only sounds you need to focus on now. Let your muscles relax, starting from your toes, working your way up through your legs, your core, your shoulders. Feel the tension release. Your breathing is slow, steady, gentle. In and out. Just like the tide pulling away from the shore, taking all the worries, all the lingering thoughts of silent villages and lost words with it. There's nothing more to figure out tonight. No more mysteries to solve, no more histories to uncover. Just this moment, this quiet space you're in. You are safe, you are comfortable, and the only language you need right now is the quiet conversation between your breath and the stillness. Let yourself drift down, down, into sleep.